Hello there, and welcome to Deep Earth Stories. Get comfortable, turn the lights down if you can. Because what we are about to explore together has been waiting a very, very long time for someone to listen. But before that, tell me in comments where are you listening from and what time is there right now, and please subscribe to my channel. Maybe you are listening in the dark right now. Maybe the room around you is quiet and the light is low and somewhere outside the world is still moving. But in here it is slow. In here it is just you and a story. Tonight, we are going to travel somewhere unusual, not to a distant planet, not to a faraway ocean. We are going to travel into the past. But not the past you learned in school. We are going to a past that some people say was hidden. A past that might have been forgotten on purpose. A world that, if you look closely at old photographs, old buildings, old maps, seems to whisper something strange, something like, "We were here before, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day press gently down into whatever you are resting on. There is no hurry tonight. This is a slow story, a long one, and it begins with a very simple question. What if the world we think we know is not the oldest version of the world? What if, beneath the streets of every great city, beneath the mud and the stone and the layers of forgotten time, there are traces of something earlier, something vast, something beautiful, something that was covered over so quietly that almost nobody noticed? Tonight, we follow that question, gently, carefully, without rushing. We are not here to frighten anyone. We are not here to shout. We are here to wonder. And wondering, it turns out, is one of the most peaceful things a human being can do. So let us begin. Chapter 1. The buildings that do not make sense. Imagine you are walking through a city. Any city. An old one. Maybe it is somewhere in Europe. Maybe the streets are made of old stone. Maybe the buildings around you are tall and pale, with columns carved from marble, with windows that arch at the top, with decorations so fine and detailed that you cannot imagine a single human hand making them. You stop in front of one of these buildings. It is beautiful. Deeply, quietly beautiful. You look at the stonework. You look at the columns. You notice that the base of the building is slightly underground. Not just a little, several feet, maybe more, as if the ground around it has risen over the years, slowly swallowing the lower parts of the structure. You look around. The same is true of other buildings nearby. Their foundations are buried, their ground floors are below street level. The streets themselves seem newer than the buildings they surround. You think to yourself, that is strange. And then you let it go. Because cities change, streets get repaved, ground levels shift over time. That is the sensible explanation. But then, you start to notice the same thing in other cities, and then other countries, and then on other continents. Old photographs from the 1800s show buildings half buried, show streets that appear to have been cut down through thick layers of earth, show doors and windows at ground level that, if you look at the buildings today, are now underground. Something happened to the ground, something raised it, something covered the lower parts of these structures. And the question that follows is both simple and enormous. What was here before? This is the beginning of what some call the mud flood theory. It is not an official scientific theory. Universities do not teach it, governments do not recognize it, historians for the most part do not discuss it. But across the internet and across certain quiet corners of research and curiosity, there are people who look at these buried buildings, and they do not accept the easy answer. They look, and they ask questions. And the questions taken together paint a picture that is hard to ignore once you have seen it. A picture of a world that existed before our own. A civilization, a global one, extraordinarily advanced, and then gone, erased, covered by mud, by time, by something that moved across the earth with such force that it buried entire cities and left survivors with no memory of what came before. The name some give to this lost civilization is Tartaria. That name carries weight, so let us sit with it for a moment before we go further. Chapter 2. The name on the old maps Tartaria. If you say it slowly, it sounds almost like a place from a dream. Tartaria. And in a way it is, because almost nobody alive today was taught about it in school. Almost nobody has heard the word used as a place name, a civilization, a real thing on a real map. And yet, if you look at maps from the 1600s, the 1700s, the early 1800s, you will find the name, right there, printed clearly. Tartaria, or sometimes Tartari, a vast region, a massive land. On some of these old maps, Tartaria covers an enormous stretch of the world, from Eastern Europe, across Central Asia, across Siberia, through parts of China, even stretching toward the coasts of North America. This was not a small region. On some historical maps, Tartaria was labelled as one of the largest territories on Earth, perhaps the largest, and in the standard histories we are taught, this place barely exists. It is occasionally mentioned as a vague barbarian region, a land of nomads, a rough, empty, uncivilized space between the known empires. But the people who study the mud flood theory look at those old maps and they say, wait, look again. They point out that cartographers, the people who made maps, did not label empty, uncivilized places with names as grand as Tartaria. They did not draw borders around them. They did not distinguish between regions like Chinese Tartaria, Muscovite Tartaria, independent Tartaria. That kind of labeling, that kind of careful subdivision of a territory, is what you do when you are describing a real political and cultural entity, a real place with real people, real structures, real governance. So who were these people? What was this civilization? The mainstream explanation is simple. Tartaria was just a loose geographic label, a European way of describing the vague nomadic steppe people of Central Asia, the Tatars, various Turkic and Mongol peoples, not a single empire, not a unified civilization, just a regional name. And that may be true. That is likely the most accurate historical explanation. But the mud flood researchers look deeper, and what they say they find is this. They say that Tartaria was not just a region, it was a civilization that stretched across the world, that built extraordinary structures, that had technology and knowledge that we do not fully understand today, and that this civilization ended suddenly, violently, and was deliberately removed from the historical record. Now, before we go further, I want to say something clearly. This is a theory, a fringe theory. It is not accepted by historians or scientists in its grand form. Many of the specific claims made within this theory are disputed, debunked, or exaggerated. But that does not mean there are no interesting questions hiding inside it. History is complicated. The historical record is imperfect. Buildings do get buried. Civilizations do get erased from memory. Power shapes what gets recorded and what gets forgotten, and the human urge to look at a beautiful old building and wonder who really built it. That urge is ancient and real and entirely understandable. So tonight, we are going to explore, with open eyes, with a healthy mind, with calm curiosity rather than desperate belief. We're going to look at the evidence that these researchers point to. We're going to think about what it might mean, and we're going to let the mystery breathe. Because mystery, handled gently, is one of the most beautiful things in the world. Chapter 3. The Orphan Trains and the Empty Cities. Here is something that is genuinely strange. Something that does not involve conspiracy or theory. Something that actually happened, that is documented, and that historians acknowledge. In the mid-1800s, particularly in the United States, something called the orphan train movement began. Between roughly 1854 and 1929, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 children, many of them very young, were loaded onto trains and sent from cities like New York to rural areas across the American Midwest and beyond. The official explanation is that these children were orphans, children of immigrants, children of poverty. The cities were overcrowded, and rural families needed workers, and this was a social program to help everyone. And again, that is likely mostly true. But the mud flood researchers point to this and say, look at the numbers, 100,000 to 200,000 children, mostly without traceable parents, in just a few decades. Where did all these children come from? And they point to photographs of cities in the American West from the 1840s and 1850s. Brand new cities, beautiful cities, some with enormous ornate buildings that look far too grand and complex to have been built by a rough frontier settlement with no electricity, no heavy machinery, and a tiny population. Buildings with intricate facades, with tall domes, with carved details that would take master craftsmen years to produce. And then they ask, Who built these buildings? Where were the workers? Where are the records of construction? Why do photographs of some early American cities show buildings that look centuries old when the cities were supposedly founded just a decade or two before the photograph was taken? These are real observations. Real photographs exist. The buildings are there. The conventional explanation is that Victorian-era builders were simply excellent. That ornate architecture was fashionable and people invested heavily in it. That skilled craftsmen came from Europe. That frontier cities wanted to appear grand and respectable, and these explanations are reasonable. But the mudflood researchers look at all of it together, the buried buildings, the massive orphan populations, the grand architecture with no construction records, the maps that show a vanished civilization, and they see a pattern. They see the aftermath of something. A world that was cleared. Children who survive something catastrophic but have no parents. Buildings that were already standing when the new settlers arrived, cleaned out, repurposed, relabeled as new construction. A civilization that had been there before and was gone. This is the central emotional claim of the mud flood theory. And it is, in a strange way, a very human one. Because humans have always felt this way at times. That something has been forgotten. That the world is older and richer than we know. That there are layers beneath layers. That we are not the first. Chapter 4. What is mud and what can it do? Let us slow down for a moment. Let us talk about something very real. Mud. Not metaphor. Actual mud. What it is, what it does, and why it matters. Mud is a mixture of water and fine particles of earth. When it flows in large quantities, it can move with extraordinary force and speed. We see this in mudslides, we see it in floods, we see it in volcanic events where ash and water mix and create rivers of thick, unstoppable material called lahars. History is full of events where entire settlements were buried by mud and debris. Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash and pumice. The ancient city of Akrotiri, on the Greek island of Santorini, was buried and preserved by a volcanic eruption. The ancient Mesopotamian city of Ur was found buried beneath deep layers of sediment. These are real events, documented, accepted by mainstream science. Mud buries things, sediment accumulates, ground levels change. Cities that were once at the surface become, over time, underground. In fact, archaeologists count on this. The entire field of archaeology is built on the understanding that the older something is, the deeper in the ground it tends to be. You dig down through layers of time. Each layer tells a story. This principle is called stratigraphy, and it is one of the foundations of how we understand the past. So the basic idea that mud and sediment could bury structures and raise ground levels is not controversial. It happens. It has happened. The question the mudflood researchers ask is, did it happen on a massive global scale? And did it happen recently enough to have wiped out a civilization that was alive and functioning just a few hundred years ago? That is where the science gets uncertain. To bury entire cities under several feet of mud in a short time, you would need an extraordinary event, something like a global flood, something like massive simultaneous volcanic activity across multiple continents, something like a pole shift or a comet impact or some other catastrophic force. These kinds of global catastrophes are not impossible. The history of Earth includes mass extinction events, massive volcanic winters, enormous floods left over from the last ice age. The Earth has been through things we can barely imagine. But a global catastrophe of this scale, recent enough to have buried recognizable buildings, recent enough that survivors could have passed down memories of a civilization called Tartaria, that would have to have happened within the last 500 years or so, and the geological and historical record does not clearly support that. Not clearly. But the mud flood researchers point to anomalies, to buried buildings that appear structurally sound, not damaged by catastrophe but simply covered, to sediment layers that seem inconsistent, to historical records from the 1800s that describe cities being dug out, streets being raised, foundations being exposed. They say the evidence is there if you know how to look. Chapter 5. The 1800s and the Great Reset. There is a particular period in history that the mud flood researchers return to again and again. The 1800s, specifically the mid to late 1800s. The period of what we call the Industrial Revolution. The period when modern Western civilization as we know it was really taking shape. Factories were being built, railways were being laid, cities were expanding rapidly. Photographs were being taken for the first time, preserving images of the world that would survive to our own day. And the mud flood researchers look at this period and they say, something is off. They say, look at the architecture. Look at the enormous, beautiful, intricately detailed public buildings that were supposedly constructed during this period. Train stations, city halls, museums, libraries, universities. Many of these buildings are breathtaking. Their facades are covered in ornate carvings. Their interiors are vast and soaring. Their stonework is precise and complex. And the researchers ask, where did all this come from? How did a civilization that was simultaneously building factories, laying thousands of miles of a railroad track, fighting major wars, and managing massive social upheaval, also find the time, the workers, the money, and the skill to construct all these extraordinary buildings? They point to specific examples. The World Expositions, also called World Fairs, that were held in major cities throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. Events like the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which featured a temporary city of astonishing classical buildings called the White City. The official story is that these buildings were temporary structures, built quickly from plaster and wood and steel frames, designed to look impressive but not meant to last. But the mud flood researchers point to photographs of these places and say, those do not look temporary. Those look like they were already standing. Like someone arrived, cleaned them out, painted them white, and then told everyone they were new. And when the expositions ended, most of these buildings were demolished, or they burned down, often in fires that seemed to consume them with suspicious completeness. Nothing left, no trace, a civilization of extraordinary beauty, erected seemingly from nothing, and then erased just as completely. The researchers see a pattern of erasure, a pattern of replacement, a new world being built on top of an old one, and the old one being deliberately hidden. Now, the conventional historians have explanations for all of this. The White City buildings were absolutely temporary. The construction records exist. The workers and their wages were documented. Photographs show the buildings under construction. These are real counter-arguments, and they matter. But the mystery of how Victorian-era humans accomplished so much so quickly, so beautifully, that mystery does not entirely disappear just because we have records. Sometimes the records themselves feel too convenient, too complete, too perfect for a period that was supposedly so chaotic, and that is where the wondering begins. Chapter 6. The Free Energy Towers. There is one specific architectural feature that the mud flood researchers return to repeatedly. One that, once you have noticed it, you start seeing everywhere. Towers, old towers, towers with specific shapes, specific proportions, specific features, particularly a style of tower that has a wide, dome-like cap on top, or a narrow spire, or a series of metal rods or points at its apex. The researchers call these free energy towers, or Tesla towers, or ether receivers. They believe these structures were not merely decorative. They were not bell towers or clock towers or simple architectural flourishes. They were, the researchers claim, components of a global energy transmission network. Let me explain what that means. In the late 1800s, a real historical figure named Nikola Tesla proposed and partially built a system for transmitting electrical energy wirelessly through the Earth and the atmosphere. He called one version of this system the Wardenclyffe Tower. He believed that energy could be broadcast through the ground, like radio waves through the air, and received by structures at other locations. Tesla's project was real. His tower was partially built on Long Island in New York. It was eventually torn down after his funding ran out. But his ideas, his patents, his notebooks, his dreams of a world powered by free, wirelessly transmitted energy, those survived. And the mud flood researchers look at Tesla and they say, he did not invent this idea, he rediscovered it. He found remnants of a technology that had existed before, a global network of energy-receiving towers built by the Tartarian civilization, still standing in his time, and he recognized what they were and tried to rebuild the system. They point to old towers across Europe, across Russia, across the Middle East, across North America. Towers with those distinctive dome-shaped caps. Towers that, if you look at the diagrams Tesla drew for his energy transmission system, bear a striking resemblance to his designs. This is one of the most poetic parts of the mud flood theory. The idea that all those beautiful old towers, the ones you see in old city skylines, the ones that seem slightly out of proportion with the buildings they sit atop, were once part of something functional, something that hummed quietly with energy, something that connected the world, and then the civilization fell, and the towers stayed standing. And centuries later, a man named Tesla looked up at them and remembered something he had never been taught. There is something deeply moving about that image, even if it is not true in the literal sense, even if it is a story rather than a history. The feeling it captures, the feeling that something beautiful was lost, that we are living in the ruins of a grander world, that energy and connection and abundance are possible if only we can remember how. That feeling is real, and it resonates with something deep in the human heart. Chapter 7. The Star Forts and the Strange Maps. Let us look at another piece of evidence that the mud flood researchers find compelling: star forts. These are a specific style of military fortification that was common in Europe and its colonies between roughly the 1500s and the 1800s. They have a distinctive shape, a polygon at the centre surrounded by pointed bastions that project outward in a star pattern. The design was practical. The star shape eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to cover every approach to the walls with overlapping fields of fire. Conventional military history explains star forts clearly and sensibly. They evolved as a response to the development of artillery. Earlier medieval castles with high, thin walls were vulnerable to cannon fire. The star fort's low, thick walls and angled bastions were designed to deflect cannonballs and prevent them from demolishing the fortifications. This is a perfectly good explanation. Historians have traced the development of star fort design through documented sources. But the mud flood researchers look at star forts and they see something different. They see hundreds, possibly thousands of these structures scattered across the globe, on every continent, in places where no military need would have required them, in remote locations. In places that, when you look at them from above using satellite images, reveal enormous, perfect geometric shapes embedded in the landscape. They say, these are not military fortifications, or not only military fortifications. They say, these are the foundations or the remnants or the layouts of a global civilization's organized settlements. That the star shape was a specific design language used by the Tartarian builders. That the geometry is not just practical, but carries meaning. Some researchers go further and claim that the star fort shapes correspond to natural energy patterns in the Earth. That the pointed bastions were designed to interact with what they call telluric currents, natural electrical currents that flow through the ground. This is where the theory moves furthest from documented history and deepest into speculation. But look at a satellite image of an old star fort sometime if you have not seen one, just for the beauty of it. The precision is extraordinary. Perfect symmetry, perfectly proportioned angles, the grass inside bright green, the earthwork still intact after centuries, water-filled moats forming perfect geometric shapes. From above, they look like something from another world, like crop circles, like mandalas, like someone long ago understood something about geometry and harmony and proportion that we have only partially recovered. Whether they were military installations or energy structures or sacred geometrical works of art, they are beautiful, and they are everywhere, and that, in itself, is worth noticing. Chapter 8. The silence in the history books. Let us sit with a question for a moment. Why are there gaps in history? Not the Tartaria theory specifically, just history in general. Historians will tell you, honestly and freely, that the historical record is full of gaps, that enormous amounts of human knowledge, culture and history have been lost, that libraries burned, that languages died without being translated, that empires fell and took their records with them. The Library of Alexandria, gone. The vast pre-Columbian libraries of the Americas, many of which were burned by Spanish conquistadors, gone. The oral histories of countless indigenous cultures, lost as languages disappeared, gone. The records of the Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest urban civilizations of the ancient world. Their writing system has never been decoded. Their history is almost entirely unknown to us. These losses are real. Historians acknowledge them. Archaeologists work carefully and patiently to recover what fragments remain. So the mud flood researchers are not wrong that history has holes in it. The holes are real. What they propose is that the holes are not accidents. They are not the natural result of time and entropy and fire and war. They are, the researchers say, deliberate. They propose that at some point in the recent past, perhaps in the 1700s or 1800s, a new global power emerged. Perhaps several powers, working in concert, or perhaps independently making the same choices. And these powers decided to establish a new world order, a new civilization, built on new terms, with new rulers, with new records of where things came from and who was in charge. And to do this, they had to erase what came before. Not entirely. You cannot erase everything. Buildings are too big to knock down all at once. Enough people survived that memories could not be completely wiped. Some records slipped through. But the narrative was reset. The history books were rewritten. The children were moved. The maps were redone. The old buildings were explained away as newly constructed. And Tartaria, the civilization that had once stretched across the world, was reduced to a vague footnote. A collection of barbarian nomads. A geographic label for nothing important. This is the grand claim, the central argument, and I want to sit with the feeling of it for a moment, separate from the question of whether it is true, because the feeling this theory produces is a very specific one. It is the feeling of standing in a room and suddenly suspecting that the walls are not where they appear to be, that the room is larger than you thought, that there is a door behind the wallpaper that has been there all along, and you only just noticed the outline. That feeling that the world is larger and stranger and older and more layered than the version we were given is one of the most powerful feelings a human being can experience. It is the feeling that drives archaeology and cosmology and philosophy and art. The feeling that there is more, that we have not yet found everything, that the surface is not the whole story. Tonight, we are living in that feeling. Not rushing to conclusions, not demanding certainty, just feeling the weight of the question, just allowing ourselves to wonder what exactly is under the mud. Chapter 9. Photographs from the edge of memory. The 1800s were the first era of photography. This matters more than it might seem, because photographs survive. They are evidence. They show us exactly what the world looked like at a specific moment. And what the early photographs show us, particularly the photographs of American and European cities from the mid to late 1800s, is a world that looks in some ways very familiar. The buildings look old, older than they should. Many of them appear to have classical, ornate architecture that suggests centuries of development, not decades. The streets in many early city photographs are empty. Strangely empty, not just because photography required long exposures and moving people would blur, but empty in a deeper way, missing the energy, the mess, the crowded humanity you would expect from a booming industrial city. Some of the early photographs of American cities show buildings with their ground floors partially below street level, show staircases leading down to entrances that were once at street level but are now below it. The mud flood researchers look at these photographs carefully. They zoom in, they note the architectural styles, they compare them to buildings in other countries, other continents, and they find similarities, a consistent visual language, a consistent set of proportions and forms and decorative elements that appear in buildings attributed to the Tartarian civilization. And they say, look, the same civilization built these, in Chicago and in Moscow, in San Francisco and in Istanbul, the same hands, the same knowledge, the same aesthetic, one world, before it was divided into separate nations with separate histories and separate records. One great civilization, stretching from sea to sea, building with a consistent vision, a unified aesthetic, a shared understanding of what beauty and function and harmony looked like, and then the mud, the reset, the orphans, the new nations writing their own new histories over the top of the old one. It is a story about loss, about the difficulty of recovering something that was deliberately buried, but also somehow a story about endurance, because the buildings are still there. In many cases, they are still standing. They survived. Whatever came after, whatever tried to cover them or explain them away or relabel them as something else, they are still there, stone and mortar. Arches and domes, towers with their caps pointed at the sky, still there after everything. And that is a kind of quiet hope. The idea that beauty is hard to erase entirely, that something of what was built and what was known and what was felt by the people of that world survived in the stone, in the form, in the image caught on the silver plates of early cameras, in the silence of a bright afternoon, in a city that was still learning its own name, Chapter 10. The feeling at the bottom of things. We are moving slowly through a very large mystery tonight, and I want to pause here in the early hours of this story and acknowledge something. You might believe this theory. You might think it is completely plausible that a vast ancient civilization was buried and forgotten and deliberately removed from history. Or you might find it impossible. You might trust the historians. You might find the evidence unconvincing or the reasoning flawed. Both responses are valid. Both responses can coexist in the same person, in the same quiet room, at the same late hour. Because the Tartaria and mud flood theories are not really asking us to make a decision tonight. They are not a test we need to pass. They are an invitation to look at the world a little differently, to notice the buildings more carefully, to ask questions about what the maps show, to wonder about the children on the trains and the grand empty buildings and the towers with their strange caps, to sit with the feeling that the world is older than we know. Because that feeling, regardless of whether Tartaria was real, is itself real. The Earth is billions of years old. Human civilization is tens of thousands of years old. The civilizations we know about through standard history represent a tiny fraction of human existence. There are real lost civilizations. There are real buried cities. There are real gaps in the historical record. The world is genuinely stranger and richer and more layered than any single history book can contain. And that tonight is enough. The mud is real. The buildings are real. The questions are real, and the story goes on. Let us drift a little further into it. The night is long, and the mystery is patient, and we have only just begun to scratch the surface of what lies beneath. There is something about the middle of the night that makes old questions feel new. The city outside is quiet. The traffic has thinned, the voices have faded. And in that quietness, it becomes easier to imagine a different world. An older one that existed before the noise we now call modern life. We were talking about mud, about buried buildings, about maps that show a vast territory called Tartaria stretching across half the world, about photographs of cities that look older than they should, about towers that some believe once hummed with wireless energy. We were standing at the edge of a very old question, and now we go deeper, not faster, never faster tonight, deeper, slowly, the way you lower yourself into warm water, one breath at a time. Chapter 11. The City Beneath the City. Imagine you're in St. Petersburg, Russia. It is a cold morning. The sky is the colour of old pewter, silver grey and flat. The Neva River is wide and dark beside you, and the wind off the water smells like iron and winter. You're standing in front of one of the enormous classical buildings that line the city's grand boulevards. Its facade is painted pale yellow, the colour of old cream. Its columns are massive, each one taller than 3 men standing on each other's shoulders. The windows are arched at the top, framed with carved stone decorations. It is extraordinary. It feels ancient. But St. Petersburg, according to standard history, was founded in 1703. It is not yet 400 years old. By the standards of world cities, it is quite young. So why does it look like this? Why do its buildings have the weight and grandeur and worn beauty of something that has existed for 1,000 years? The official answer is that Peter the Great, the Tsar who founded the city, was deeply influenced by Western European architecture. He brought craftsmen and architects from Italy, France, Holland, Germany. He wanted his new capital to look like the great cities of Europe. He spent enormous resources to make it so. This is documented. It is historically supported. There are records of the architects, the budgets, the construction. And yet, the mudflood researchers look at St. Petersburg and they see something else. They point to photographs taken in the late 1800s that show certain streets and buildings with ground floors that appear below the current street level. They point to the sheer scale of the architecture and ask whether a newly founded city on a swampy riverbank, with limited population and no established construction industry, could really have produced buildings of this complexity and grandeur within just a few decades. They point to historical accounts describing workers digging through deep layers of soil to lay the city's foundations, and they ask, what was already in that soil? What were they digging through? And then they mention something fascinating, something real. In 2003 and in subsequent years, archaeologists working in St. Petersburg did indeed find evidence of earlier occupation. Older settlements, foundations and artifacts predating the 1703 founding of the city. Now, this is not entirely surprising. Humans have lived along the Neva River for thousands of years. Finding older settlements beneath a modern city is not unusual, but the mudflood researchers use this as a starting point. They say, if there were people here before Peter the Great, what did they build? How sophisticated were they? And why was the city described as being built on empty swampland when there were clearly already structures and settlements present? They suggest that Peter the Great did not build a new city. He rebuilt one. He repurposed what was already there. He brought his European architects not to design new buildings from scratch, but to renovate and reframe structures that already existed, fitting them into his new vision of a modern Russian empire. The history was then rewritten to show construction where there was really restoration, to show creation where there was really reclamation. This is the pattern that the mudflood researchers see everywhere they look, not building, reclaiming, not inventing, remembering. Chapter 12. Moscow and the Kremlin's strange foundations. Let us stay in Russia for a moment, because Russia is central to the Tartaria theory. If Tartaria was a real civilization, its heartland, according to many of the old maps, was the vast territory of what is now Russia, Siberia, and Central Asia. The Russian Empire, which expanded dramatically in the 1700s and 1800s, swallowed up much of what the old maps labelled as Tartaria. And in the theory, this expansion was not peaceful exploration and settlement of empty land. It was conquest, and it was erasure. The Russian Empire, the theory says, moved into Tartarian territory, subjugated or killed the existing population, tore down or buried the evidence of their civilization, and replaced the history with its own narrative. And Moscow, the old heart of Russia, sits at the centre of this claim, the Kremlin. The word itself comes from an old Slavic word meaning citadel, or fortress at the centre of a city. Every major Russian city once had a Kremlin, a fortified centre, a complex of walls and towers and cathedrals. The Moscow Kremlin is the most famous. Its walls are enormous, its towers are ancient, its history, by the official record, stretches back to the 12th century. But the mudflood researchers point to the Kremlin's architecture and say, look at the towers, look at their caps, look at the proportions, look at the decorative elements. They do not look like the other medieval fortifications of Europe. They have those distinctive pointed caps, those specific proportions, those design elements that the researchers associate with the Tartarian building style. They say the Kremlin was not built by the Russians who claimed it. It was inherited, found, occupied and renamed and incorporated into a new identity. The researchers point to the fact that large portions of the Moscow Kremlin were renovated in the 1400s and 1500s by Italian architects hired by Ivan the Great. They ask, why would a Russian ruler hire Italian architects to build a Russian fortress? Why would Italians from the other side of a continent be the best choice for a purely Russian project? The conventional answer is that Italian architects during the Renaissance were the best in Europe. Hiring them was a status symbol. Even the Great wanted the best. But the mudflood researchers say the Italians were not hired to build. They were hired because they were the only people available who understood the existing structures well enough to work with them. They had knowledge of classical and Tartarian building techniques that had been partially preserved in Western Europe. They came to Russia not to create something new, but to repair and extend something very old. Now, as always, I want to say clearly, this is speculation. This is the theory, not established history. But there is something poetic about the idea, about the image of Italian builders arriving in Moscow in the 1400s and standing before these enormous ancient walls, recognizing something in their proportions, something they had seen in their own country's ruins, and realizing they were looking at the same civilization, the same source. A world that had once been whole, scattered now into fragments, but still recognizable if you knew what to look for. Chapter 13. The Stolen Children of History. We touched earlier on the orphan train movement in America. Let us go back to it, because it is one of the pieces of this theory that sits most heavily on the heart, not because it proves the mudflood theory. It does not in any strict sense, but because the questions it raises are real, and the answers we have are incomplete, and the human cost of those gaps is immense. Between 1854 and 1929, as many as 200,000 children were transported by organisations like the Children's Aid Society, from cities on the American East Coast to rural communities across the Midwest and the West. The official history is clear on this. The movement was founded by a man named Charles Loring Brace, a social reformer who was deeply concerned about the large number of homeless and orphaned children living on the streets of New York City. He believed that placing these children with rural farming families would give them better lives than the overcrowded city orphanages could provide. Many of these children did find good homes. Many went on to have full, ordinary lives. The program had real humanitarian intentions, but the records of where all these children came from are incomplete. Many of them had no known parents, no known relatives, no traceable history. They simply appeared in the city's streets and institutions, unnamed or with names given to them by whoever found them. The mud flood researchers look at these numbers and they ask, where did 200,000 parentless children come from in just a few decades? And they connect it to something else. They note that the same period, the mid-1800s, saw extraordinary demographic disruptions in Russia and Central Asia. Wars, famines, population movements. The Russian Empire was consolidating control over enormous territories during this period, often violently. They suggest, and this is speculative, that some of the children who ended up on American orphan trains were not street children from New York. They were, somehow, survivors of a much larger catastrophe. Displaced children from a civilization that had been destroyed. Moved across the world, their origins obscured, their identities reset. This part of the theory requires the most charity to follow. It requires leaps that the evidence does not easily support. But the underlying grief in it is real. Because history is, in fact, full of displaced children, full of orphaned populations, full of communities that were destroyed and whose children were scattered and lost. This happened to indigenous peoples across North and South America, to enslaved Africans and their descendants, to populations displaced by the great wars of the 20th century. The specific claim about Tartarian orphans is not proven, but the general truth that powerful civilizations erase and displace weaker ones, and that the children pay the price, that is not a theory. That is history. And sitting with that truth quietly in the dark without needing to assign it to any specific theory is itself a worthwhile thing to do. Chapter 14. The World Fairs and the White City. It is 1893. The city of Chicago is preparing for something extraordinary, a world exposition, an international fair, a celebration of 400 years since Columbus arrived in the Americas, though it opens a year late. They are calling it the World's Columbian Exposition, and to host it, they are building a city within a city. Imagine it. You arrive by train from the city centre, you step out onto a long promenade, and before you, stretching in every direction, is a collection of buildings unlike anything you have ever seen. They are enormous. Their facades are white, brilliant white, almost glowing in the summer light. Their columns are massive. Their domes soar. Their proportions are perfect, serene, monumental. It looks like ancient Rome, like ancient Greece. Like something from a dream of a civilization more grand than any that actually existed. They call it the White City. And it is, officially, a temporary construction. These buildings were built quickly, from plaster of Paris mixed with cement and jute fibre, applied over steel and wood frames. They were meant to last only the duration of the fair, less than a year. After the exposition closed, most of them were demolished. Several burned in fires. By 1894, the White City was almost entirely gone, but the photographs survive, and the mud flood researchers look at those photographs very carefully. They point to the scale of the buildings. They ask how temporary structures built in just a few years could appear so large, so perfectly proportioned, so worn and weathered and ancient looking. They point to details in the photographs that suggest not new plaster but old stone, not fresh construction but cleaned and repainted existing structures. They point to the sheer number of grand buildings at the fair, dozens of enormous classical structures, and they ask how an industrial city with a workforce primarily occupied by factories and rail yards could have produced all this in addition to its regular economic activity, and they say these buildings were already there. The exposition was organised around existing structures. Those structures were documented as temporary to explain why they would disappear after the fair, and when the fair ended, the demolition and the fires made sure there would be little left to examine too closely. The conventional counter-argument is strong. There are detailed construction records. There are accounts from workers who built the buildings. There are architects like Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted whose design documents survive. The buildings were built, the records are there. But the mud flood researchers ask, what are records? Records can be created. Documents can be produced after the fact. The 19th century was not an age of digital verification. A document saying a building was constructed is not the same as watching it be constructed. And here, of course, the theory brushes against a familiar problem. The problem with any conspiracy-style theory is that it tends to be unfalsifiable. Any evidence against it can be dismissed as part of the conspiracy. Any document can be called fabricated. Any expert can be called compromised. This is a real weakness in the theory, and it is worth naming clearly. Because the willingness to dismiss all counter-evidence is not strength. It is not rigour. It is the opposite of careful thinking. The best version of the mud flood theory is not the one that dismisses everything. It is the one that says, here are genuine anomalies. Here are questions that have not been fully answered. Here are gaps worth examining, and tonight, that is the version we are holding. The questioning version, the wondering version, not certain, not credulous, just open. Chapter 15. Cathedrals and the Question of Time. Let us think about cathedrals. Specifically, let us think about how long it takes to build one. The great medieval cathedrals of Europe are among the most extraordinary structures ever built by human hands. Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres Cathedral, Cologne Cathedral, the Cathedral of Burgos in Spain. These buildings took not years but generations to construct. Notre Dame took nearly 2 centuries from the laying of its foundation stone to something approaching completion. Cologne Cathedral was begun in the 13th century and not finished until the 19th. Nearly 600 years of construction. Generations of builders worked on these structures and died without ever seeing them finished. Their children continued the work, and their children's children. This kind of multi-generational commitment to a single building project is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. We build things in years, sometimes in months. The idea of beginning a project that will not be completed in your great-great-grandchild's lifetime is foreign to us. But it was normal then, at least that is what the history tells us. The mud flood researchers look at cathedrals and they ask a different question. Not how long did it take to build these, but did they take that long? They point to the extraordinary precision of cathedral construction, the perfect geometric relationships, the complex structural engineering that distributes weight through arches and flying buttresses in ways that were not formally understood mathematically until much later in history. They ask how builders using only hand tools, without calculators, without formal structural engineering theory, without modern surveying equipment produce structures of such complexity and precision. They say, perhaps they did not. Perhaps these structures were built by a civilization that had more knowledge, more technology, more sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering than we give them credit for. Not the gradual medieval builders, but an earlier, more advanced civilization, the Tartarians. And then the medieval builders found these structures, repaired them, added to them, and eventually claimed them as their own. This is the cathedral theory within the mud flood framework, and it touches something that mainstream architecture history also grapples with, not in conspiracy terms, but in genuine scholarly uncertainty. Because the medieval builders did have sophisticated knowledge. We know this. The fact that Chartres still stands after 9 centuries is proof that whoever built it understood structural engineering at a deep practical level. How they gained that knowledge, through what transmission of learning from ancient Roman and Greek builders, through what accumulated practical experience, through what lost texts, is a genuine historical question. The mud flood theory simply adds another possible answer to that question. And while most historians would not accept it, the question itself is legitimate. Knowledge comes from somewhere. Skills are transmitted across time in ways that are not always documented. What was handed down, what was inherited, what was found and recognized and used again. These are questions that archaeology and history wrestle with constantly. Chapter 16. The language. Nobody speaks here is something strange. Among the things the old maps label within Tartaria, beyond just the geographic region, there are references to a Tartarian people, a Tartarian culture, a Tartarian language. Historians discuss the Tatars, the Turkic peoples of Central Asia and Eastern Europe, whose name gave rise to the word Tartary. Their languages are documented. Their history, while often marginalized in mainstream Western accounts, is real and traceable. But the mud flood researchers suggest that the original Tartarian language was something different, something older, something that was not merely the language of the Tatar peoples, but a root language, a source language, something that predated the division of human languages into the families we know today. This is deeply speculative. The study of historical linguistics is complex and well developed, and most linguists would find this claim difficult to support. But there is something real hidden inside it, something worth noticing. The question of the origin of human language, the question of whether there was once a more unified system of human communication before the great dispersal of peoples across the globe, the question of whether lost languages carried knowledge that was irretrievable once the languages died. These are real questions. Linguists work on them, anthropologists explore them. The Indo-European language family is enormous. It connects languages as seemingly different as English, Greek, Sanskrit, Persian and Lithuanian, tracing them back to a hypothetical common ancestor language spoken perhaps 6,000 years ago. There are other language families, each one a tree with its own deep roots. But before the trees, what? Was there, as some linguists speculatively propose, a deeper common ancestor? A proto-human language or language system that existed before the great geographical dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa? We do not know. We may never know. But the mud flood researchers in their own way are reaching for the same question. The question of what existed before the recorded beginning. The question of the root. And that question resonates across linguistics, archaeology, mythology, and the quiet wondering that happens in dark rooms at late hours. What existed before the beginning of our story? Chapter 17. The maps and the possibility. Let us return to the maps one more time, because they deserve more attention than we have given them so far. The maps that show Tartaria are real historical documents. They are preserved in archives and libraries. They were made by real cartographers working with the best knowledge available to them in the 1600s, 1700s and early 1800s. And they show a territory labelled Tartaria or Tartary that stretches, in some versions, across an enormous portion of the Eurasian continent. Now, the mainstream historical explanation for this is straightforward. European geographers and cartographers use the name Tartary to describe a vast, poorly understood region beyond the edges of their reliable knowledge. It was, in some ways, a catch-all label for the unknown, for the steppe, for the nomadic peoples who lived in ways that European scholars did not fully understand. As European knowledge of these regions improved, through trade, through the great explorations, through diplomatic and scientific missions, the label Tartary gradually disappeared from maps, replaced by more specific regional names. This is a good explanation. It is historically supported. But the mud flood researchers point to something else in these maps. They point to the internal subdivisions, to the fact that many maps distinguish between Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, and independent Tartary. They argue that this level of geographic specificity implies a real, organised, politically significant entity, not just a vague label for the unknown. They also point to a specific, real historical event. In 1755, the Qing dynasty of China, in a series of military campaigns known as the Dzunga Genocide, essentially destroyed the Dzunga Khanate, a major Oirat Mongol state in Central Asia. The Dzunga people were nearly completely annihilated. Estimates of the death toll range from 480,000 to over 800,000 people, a significant fraction of the total Dzunga population. This event is real. It is documented. It is acknowledged by historians as one of the largest genocides in Asian history. And the mud flood researchers point to it and say, this is what the end of Tartaria looked like, or part of it. The deliberate destruction of a people, a civilization, a culture, erased within a few decades, leaving almost nothing behind. The Dzungas were not the Tartarians in the grand, global sense the theory proposes. They were one Central Asian people among many. The leap from the Dzunga genocide to a global civilizational erasure is enormous, but the underlying fact is sobering. A civilization can be destroyed, a people can be nearly eliminated within a few decades, and the historical memory of that civilization can be reduced to a few academic footnotes, known only to specialists, invisible to the general public. This is not theory, this is history. And sitting with that, quietly, in the night, it makes you wonder what else has been lost. What other worlds have been reduced to footnotes? What other peoples have vanished from the general memory, leaving only their buildings, their art, and their bones in the deep soil? The world is older than we remember, and it has known more loss than any map can show. Chapter 18, The Architecture of Grief. There is a way that buildings hold time, not metaphorically, not poetically, though that is true as well, literally, physically. When stone is cut, the minerals within it carry a record of when they were formed. When mortar sets, it traps air from the moment of its mixing. When wood is used in construction, its growth rings carry the story of every year of its life. Scientists can read these records. Dendrochronology reads the tree rings in wooden beams to date construction. Optically stimulated luminescence measures when sand grains in mortar or plaster were last exposed to light, which tells us when they were buried. Radiocarbon dating works on organic materials used in construction. These tools are real, they give us real dates. And in general, when these tools are applied to old buildings, the dates match the official historical record fairly closely. The stone at Chartres Cathedral is medieval. The wood beams in ancient Japanese temples are centuries old. The mud flood researchers respond to this in various ways. Some say the dating tools are not as reliable as scientists claim. Some say they were applied selectively to surfaces that were renovated rather than original cores. Some say the dates confirm the buildings are old, but not who built them originally. Some simply acknowledge the counter-evidence and hold their theory more loosely. The loosely held version of the theory is, I think, the most interesting. It says, "We are not certain of everything. We do not have all the evidence. But something about this story feels true. Something about the buildings feels older than the history says. Something about the gaps in the record feels intentional rather than accidental. And that something deserves more investigation. Not by conspiracy theorists alone, but by careful, open-minded scholars. By archaeologists willing to dig where others have not dug. By historians willing to ask questions that the official record does not answer. Because the official record is not the whole story. It never is. No record ever captures everything. No history book contains the full truth of what it describes. Every account is partial. Every map is incomplete. And that incompleteness is not a reason for despair. It is an invitation to keep asking, to keep digging, to keep holding space for what has not yet been found. The world beneath the mud is patient. Whatever is there, whatever has been buried, whether it is the remnants of a global civilization or just the ordinary accumulation of sediment over centuries, it will wait. It has waited this long, and somewhere, in a university archive or a forgotten corner of a library, or in a photograph not yet digitized, or in the soil beneath a parking lot in a city whose name we do not know yet, a piece of the answer is resting, quietly, patiently, in the dark, waiting to be found. Chapter 19, Silk Roads and Invisible Empires. Let us think about the Silk Road. The name calls up images, long camel caravans moving through desert and mountain, merchants from a dozen different cultures meeting at crossroads cities, spices and silk and glass and gold moving in slow, centuries-long flows from east to west and west to east. The Silk Road was not one road, it was a network. A web of routes that connected China to the Mediterranean, running through Central Asia, through Persia, through Anatolia, through Arabia. And Central Asia, the heart of this network, was the heart of Tartaria. The great Silk Road cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Kashgar, these were not crude outposts. These were sophisticated urban centres of learning, of trade, of architecture, of science, of mathematics. The Islamic Golden Age, which produced extraordinary advances in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy and architecture, was centred largely in Central Asia and the Middle East. The scholars of Samarkand and Baghdad and Cairo were among the most sophisticated thinkers of their era. And the mud flood researchers say, this is a trace of what Tartaria was. This is a fragment of the civilization's knowledge surviving in the cultures that came after it. The brilliant scholars of the Islamic Golden Age were not building from nothing. They were working with knowledge inherited from something older, something that predated the Islamic conquests, something that had existed in Central Asia for a very long time. The conventional historians would say the Islamic Golden Age was extraordinary precisely because scholars translated and built upon Greek and Persian knowledge, combined with original discoveries in mathematics like algebra, and in astronomy and in medicine. Both things can be true. A civilization can inherit knowledge and also innovate. A culture can be built on older foundations and still be extraordinary in its own right. But the image of Central Asia as the crossroads of the ancient world, as the place where trade and knowledge and art flowed for millennia before the modern era, that image is not conspiracy. That is history. The Silk Road civilizations were real. They were grand. And much of their history has been lost, or is unknown to people in the Western world, or exists only in specialist scholarship far from the mainstream. The mud flood theory, in its attention to Central Asia and its grand claims about Tartaria, is at least drawing attention toward a part of the world and a collection of cultures that deserve far more recognition than they typically receive. And that is not nothing. That is something worth taking with you, even if you set aside the rest of the theory. The middle of the world has a history as deep and rich and complex as anything that happened at the edges, and we are only beginning, really, to understand it. Chapter 20. What the ground knows. The ground knows things. This sounds like a line from a poem. But it is also science. Soil science, geoarchaeology, stratigraphy. All of these fields are built on the understanding that the ground records what happens to it, that the layers of Earth carry information about climate, about catastrophe, about human habitation, about the passage of time. When archaeologists dig, they read those layers. A dark layer of carbon might indicate a fire. A thick layer of silt might indicate a flood. A concentration of animal bones and pottery sherds indicates a settlement. A layer of sterile soil between two layers of habitation indicates abandonment. A gap. A silence. The ground tells the story of what happened, and in many places around the world there are layers in the ground that are not fully explained. There are layers of what appears to be fine, uniformly distributed sediment in places where gradual natural accumulation does not fully account for its presence. There are layers that some researchers interpret as the remnant of a rapid, large-scale, depositional event, something that came quickly and covered everything beneath it. In some places beneath these anomalous sediment layers, there are human artifacts, signs of habitation, evidence of a world that existed before the layer was laid down. These findings are real, though their interpretation is debated. Mainstream geologists and geoarchaeologists have explanations for most of them. River flooding, aeolian deposition, gradual soil movement, volcanic ashfall. But the mud flood researchers point to these layers and say, this is the physical evidence. This is what remains of the event. The great flood of mud and debris that covered the old world and created the ground we now walk on. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, the layers are there. The ground does know things. And the things it knows are strange and old and incompletely understood. The earth beneath our feet has been accumulating stories for hundreds of millions of years. The stories of glaciers that covered continents, of seas that covered mountains, of forests that became coal, of life that died and became the fuel that runs our modern world. We walk on top of all of that. Every step we take is taken on top of an inconceivable depth of history. And even just a few feet down, in the soil beneath your nearest street, there are things that have not been seen for centuries. Pottery, coins, bones, the residue of fires, the remnants of walls. The ground is full of stories, most of them will never be told. But some of them, the ones that are found by careful hands and patient eyes, those stories rise up through the layers and find their way into the light, and we listen to them, the way we are listening tonight, slowly, quietly, with everything set aside except the simple, endless desire to know what came before. The night has deepened now. If you have been listening since the beginning, you have travelled a long way already, through buried cities and old maps, through orphaned trains and white cities, through the ground's long memory and the towers that some believe once sang with invisible energy. And still the story continues, because the mystery of Tartaria is not a small one. It is not the kind of mystery that resolves quickly, that ties itself up neatly, that gives you a clean answer and sends you to sleep satisfied. It is the other kind of mystery, the kind that opens outward, the kind where each question leads to three more, the kind that sits inside you quietly, long after the story's finished and continues to hum. Let us go deeper still. Chapter 21. The bells beneath the ice. Imagine the far north of Russia, Siberia, a place so vast it contains multiple time zones, a place where, in winter, the temperature drops so low that the air itself seems to crystallize, where the light in January lasts only a few hours, where the silence is so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. For centuries, Siberia was described in Western accounts as an empty wilderness, a wasteland, a place of exile where the Russian Empire sent its criminals and its dissidents to disappear. But Siberia is not, and was not, empty. It is one of the largest landmasses on Earth. It contains enormous rivers, rich forests, ancient lakes. And if you look at the old maps, it is labelled as part of Tartaria, one of the great subdivisions, Great Tartary. The indigenous peoples of Siberia, the Yakuts, the Evenks, the Buryats, the Nenets, and dozens of other groups, have lived in this land for thousands of years. Their cultures are ancient, their knowledge of the landscape is extraordinary. Their oral traditions carry histories that stretch back beyond the reach of any written record. And in those oral traditions, across many different Siberian cultures, there are stories. Stories of an earlier time, a time when the land was different, when the climate was warmer, when there were cities or great settlements in places that are now empty tundra or dense forest. Stories of a catastrophe, a great cold, a great darkness, a time when the sky changed and the animals died and the people who had lived in the old ways were forced to move, to change, to forget. These are not scientific evidence. Oral traditions are not history in the academic sense. They shift and evolve over generations, and distinguishing historical memory from mythology is extraordinarily difficult. But they are not nothing either. Across the world, many ancient oral traditions have been found to contain accurate memories of real geological and climatic events. Indigenous Australian oral traditions appear to contain memories of sea level changes that occurred more than 10,000 years ago, when the end of the last ice age caused the oceans to rise and flood coastal areas. These traditions described specific geographic features that had been underwater for millennia, and when marine geologists surveyed those areas, they found the features exactly where the tradition said they would be. The human memory, carried in story and song across generations, can preserve real information for an extraordinary length of time. So when Siberian oral traditions speak of an earlier world, a warmer world, a world with more people and more structure, before a great catastrophe changed everything, perhaps there is something there worth listening to. Not literally, not as precise historical record, but as a signal, a faint frequency coming through the noise of time saying, something happened here, something was lost. We remember it, even if we can no longer say exactly what it was. Chapter 22. The Mammoth Graveyards. While we're in Siberia, let us talk about the mammoths, because the mammoths, in their strange and terrible end, are relevant to our story. Woolly mammoths were the great shaggy tusked elephants of the Ice Age. They roamed across Eurasia and North America for hundreds of thousands of years. They were well adapted to cold climates, they were social animals, they were intelligent, and then, relatively suddenly, they disappeared. The mainstream explanation is a combination of factors: climate change as the Ice Age ended, and hunting pressure from expanding human populations. A combination of environmental shifts and human predation that together tipped the mammoths toward extinction. This is probably correct, at least for most mammoth populations, but in Siberia something strange happened. Frozen in the permafrost, the permanently frozen ground of Siberia, researchers have found mammoth remains that are extraordinarily well preserved. Not bones only. Entire bodies, skin, hair, muscle, stomach contents, in some cases blood that was still liquid when exposed after thousands of years. Some of these mammoths were found in positions that suggest they died suddenly, not gradually, not from slow starvation or disease, in positions that suggest they were alive and then very quickly were not. And in some of the stomach contents, researchers found undigested food, grasses and flowers and other plant material that the animal had been eating moments before it died. Plants that, in some cases, were species that no longer grow in that region. Plants that grow in warmer climates. This suggests that these mammoths were alive in a much warmer Siberia, eating warm climate plants, and then died suddenly, and were frozen so rapidly that their stomach contents did not have time to decompose. What could freeze a large animal so rapidly that its stomach contents are preserved thousands of years later? An extraordinarily sudden drop in temperature. the climate shift so rapid that it was not a gradual change but something more like an impact, an event. Some researchers have proposed a comet impact or airburst as a possible trigger for the rapid cooling that ended the Ice Age's Younger Dryas period, around 12,000 years ago. This is known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and while it remains controversial, it has been published in peer-reviewed scientific literature and is taken seriously by some researchers. The mudflood researchers look at the frozen mammoths and they say, this is evidence of a catastrophe, a sudden massive event that changed the climate rapidly. And they say this event, or perhaps a later similar one, is what ended the Tartarian civilization. The mammoths are not direct evidence of Tartaria. The timeline does not match neatly. The major mammoth extinctions are much older than the proposed Tartarian period, but the mammoths are evidence of something real, that the Earth has experienced sudden dramatic climate shifts, that landscapes can change quickly, that a world that was warm and rich can become cold and empty within a time span shorter than a human lifetime. The Earth has done this before, and the ghost of that knowledge preserved in the frozen ground of Siberia, in the undigested flowers in a mammoth's stomach, in the stories of indigenous peoples who remember a warmer world, that ghost drifts through the Tartaria theory like cold air under a door. Something ended, something changed, something was lost, and the ground remembers, even when we do not. Chapter 23. Tartaria and the Great Tartars. Let us spend a little time with the actual historical Tatars, because they deserve more than a footnote in this story. The Tatar peoples are Turkic ethnic groups who have lived across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Siberia and China for centuries. Today there are several million Tatars, with significant populations in Russia, particularly in the Republic of Tatarstan, and in Ukraine, Crimea and Kazakhstan. Their history is long and complex. They were part of the Great Mongol Empire that, under Genghis Khan and his successors in the 13th century, created the largest contiguous land empire in history. Stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, the Mongol Empire was extraordinary in its reach, its organizational sophistication, and its cultural complexity. After the Mongol Empire fragmented, various Tatar states and Khanates continued to exist across Central Asia and Eastern Europe. The Crimean Khanate lasted until 1783, when it was absorbed by the Russian Empire. The Khanate of Kazan fell to Ivan the Terrible in 1552. Other Tatar polities were gradually absorbed, conquered, or displaced over the following centuries. These are real events, real history. The Tatar peoples were not a myth. They were not a label for emptiness. They were real human beings with real cultures, real languages, real political structures, real cities. Kazan, the capital of modern Tatarstan, is a city with a rich history of Tatar art, architecture and scholarship. The Tatar language is still spoken by millions. Tatar literature, music and culinary traditions are alive and vibrant. The mud flood theory, in its grandest form, sometimes treats the Tatars as a vague footnote to a larger story, as the ordinary people who happen to share a name with the glorious lost civilization of Tartaria. This is at best a misrepresentation. At worst, it erases a real people and their real history in order to replace them with a fantasy. This is one of the genuine criticisms of the theory, that in seeking a lost civilization, it sometimes looks past real civilizations. That in mourning an imagined erasure, it contributes to a real one. The Tatars were here, they are here, their history is extraordinary, and they do not need to be replaced by a mythological Tartaria to be worthy of attention. The challenge for anyone exploring the mud flood theory is to hold two things at once: the genuine historical complexity of Central Asia and its many real rich cultures, and the genuine mystery of what may lie beneath the layers of the story we have been told. These two things do not have to cancel each other out. Real civilizations can coexist with unexplained anomalies. Real history can have gaps. Real people can live on top of earlier histories that have not been fully recovered. The Tatars of today carry a history that goes back many centuries, and that history itself, that rich, complicated, partially erased history of a people who were conquered and marginalized and dispersed, is itself a story of what the world does to civilizations it finds inconvenient. Chapter 24. The Shape of Forgotten Cities. Let us think about urban planning. When a city is built without a plan, it grows organically. Streets follow the paths that people naturally walked. Buildings cluster around markets and water sources. The city spreads outward in an irregular fractal pattern, dense in some places and sparse in others. You can see this in the old cores of medieval European cities: narrow winding streets, irregular block shapes, no obvious overall geometry. But when a city is planned, it has a different geometry. It is organised. The streets run straight and parallel. Blocks are regular. There is often a central plaza or axis around which everything else is arranged. The Romans planned their cities this way. So did the ancient Greeks. So did many Mesopotamian urban planners. And here is something interesting. Many of the cities that the mud flood researchers point to as evidence of Tartarian construction share a specific set of urban planning characteristics. Wide, radial boulevards extending outward from a central point, circular or semicircular arrangements of grand public buildings, extensive canal systems, large central parks or plazas, a consistent scale and proportion to the street grid. Look at the city plans of Moscow, of St. Petersburg, of Washington, D.C., of Paris after Haussmann's 19th century renovation, of Chicago's grid, of many American cities laid out in the mid-1800s. There is a consistency, a family resemblance. The mainstream explanation is that European urban planning traditions, especially the Baroque and neoclassical traditions of the 17th and 18th centuries, produced a consistent aesthetic that was exported around the world. As European empires expanded and as the new United States was founded, planners trained in European traditions applied European planning principles to new cities. This is a good explanation. It is historically supported. But the mud flood researchers point to it and say, the consistency is too global. It appears in places that had no documented contact with European planning traditions. It appears in cities that were supposedly founded before the formal development of those traditions. It suggests not imitation but inheritance, a shared template, a global urban design language that predated the cities that now use it, not invented separately by Romans and Baroque planners and American surveyors, but inherited by all of them from something earlier, something that had at some point organised cities the same way across the whole world. This is the vision at the heart of the Tartaria theory. Not just a lost civilization, but a lost global civilization. One that understood something about how to build human settlements that we have been slowly, imperfectly rediscovering ever since. Wide avenues, green spaces, water flowing through the centre, buildings designed to inspire awe and calm rather than anxiety and oppression. A city meant to make human beings feel part of something larger than themselves. That vision, whether it belongs to the Tartarians or to the long tradition of human urban idealism, is a beautiful one, and it is worth sitting with tonight. Chapter 25. The Tartarian Aesthetic. There is something specific about the aesthetic of the buildings the mud flood researchers attribute to Tartaria. Something that, once you have noticed it, you do recognise across many different contexts. A fondness for domes, for arches, for columns, for symmetry, for the integration of natural forms, leaves, flowers, vines into architectural ornament, for a scale that is grand but not brutal, for a proportion that feels somehow correct, as if the buildings are sized not for power but for beauty. This aesthetic is sometimes called Tartarian architecture by the researchers, and they point to examples of it in the most unexpected places. In the old railway stations of Europe and America, with their soaring iron and glass canopies and their ornate brick facades. In the old post offices and courthouses of American cities, many of them built in the mid to late 1800s, with their classical columns and their elaborate cornices. In the mosques and madrasas of Central Asia, with their spectacular tilework and their perfectly proportioned minarets. In the temples of India, in the palaces of Persia, in the pagodas of China. The researchers see a single design language expressed in all of these places, a single aesthetic sensibility that moved across the world through a civilization that was itself global. Mainstream architectural historians see something different. They see multiple distinct architectural traditions, each developed independently or through documented cultural exchange. They see the Islamic Golden Age's architecture building on Persian and Byzantine precedents. They see Indian temple architecture developing through its own long internal tradition. They see Western classical architecture tracing its roots to Greece and Rome. These are not the same thing. These traditions are different from each other in fundamental ways. But there is a genuine, documented phenomenon in architectural history called architectural diffusion. The spread of building techniques and aesthetic ideas across cultures through trade, through military conquest, through the movement of craftsmen and scholars, the Silk Road was not just a road for goods, it was a road for ideas, for art, for architectural knowledge. Builders from different cultures met at crossroads cities and learned from each other. Techniques developed in one place travelled to others. Aesthetic ideas crossed oceans and mountains. So the family resemblance between buildings in different parts of the world is not, by itself, evidence of a single lost civilization. It is also consistent with the well-documented spread of ideas through human contact over thousands of years, but it is beautiful regardless of its explanation. The fact that a trader in 10th century Samarkand and a builder in 19th century Chicago and a craftsman in 15th century Isfahan all reach toward arches and domes and symmetry and organic ornament, that says something about human beings, about what we find beautiful, about what we reach toward when we have the means to build something extraordinary. We reach toward curves, toward height, toward the integration of nature and structure, toward something that makes us feel both small and held, and that reaching, across all the centuries and all the distances, is one of the most moving things about the human story. Chapter 26. The problem with forgetting history has a forgetting problem, not a conspiracy. Not a deliberate erasure, though deliberate erasure does happen, but a structural problem. A problem built into the nature of how knowledge gets passed down. Things get written down only when someone decides to write them, and the people who decide what gets written are usually the ones with power, with resources, with institutions to support them. The farmer does not write a history. The slave does not write a history. The nomad does not write a history. The woman in most historical periods does not write a history. The king writes a history. The conqueror writes a history. The church writes a history. The university writes a history. And so the histories we have are the histories of power, of the people and institutions that had the means to produce and preserve written records. Everything else, the vast majority of human experience, the inner lives of ordinary people, the knowledge of subsistence farmers, the sophisticated cosmologies of nomadic peoples, the building techniques of craftsmen who learned by doing and taught by showing, not by writing. All of that is largely gone. Not because it was deliberately hidden, but because it was never written down to begin with, because the structures that would have preserved it did not exist or did not survive. The mud flood theory is in part a response to this structural forgetting, an attempt to say there was more. There were people and civilizations and knowledge that the written record does not contain, and in that impulse it is reaching for something real. The record we have is incomplete, enormously, staggeringly incomplete. The Indus Valley civilization flourished for 1,000 years. Its cities were sophisticated, well-planned, with advanced drainage systems and standardized weights and measures, and we know almost nothing about it. Its writing has not been decoded. Its rulers are unknown. Its religion is a matter of speculation. 1,000 years of a major civilization, and we have almost no narrative knowledge of it. The pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas, the ancient kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa, the maritime civilizations of the Pacific. All of these had histories as long and complex as anything in the Mediterranean world. Much of that history is gone, not because of Tartaria, not because of a global reset, but because of fire and war and the structural bias of written records toward power. The forgetting is real. The question the mud flood theory raises, what else have we forgotten, is real. But the specific answer it proposes, Tartaria, the mud flood, the deliberate global erasure, that is where the evidence becomes thin and the speculation becomes grand. Real forgetting and imagined forgetting are different things, but both deserve attention, because even the imagined version points toward the real one, and the real one is worth grieving. Chapter 27. The river remembers. There is a river in Siberia called the Ob. It is one of the longest rivers in the world. It flows for nearly 3,500 miles from the mountains of Central Asia northward, through the heart of the continent, through forests and tundra to the Arctic Ocean. Along its banks there are places where the soil, when it erodes, reveals layers of ancient life, bones of animals that lived before the Ice Age, seeds of plants that no longer grow in those latitudes, the occasional glimpse of something worked by human hands, a shaped stone, a fragment of pottery, a trace of charred wood from a fire that burned long before any written record was kept. The Ob River has been flowing for tens of thousands of years. It was flowing when mammoths grazed along its banks. It was flowing when the first human beings walked across the land bridge from Asia to the Americas. It was flowing when the civilizations of the ancient Middle East were just beginning to develop writing. And it flows today, wide and slow and immensely old, past towns and cities that sit on its banks without fully knowing what lies beneath them. The river knows things, not metaphorically. In its sediment, in the layered memory of its floodplain, in the bones and artifacts preserved in its banks, the river holds a record of everything that has happened near it. We have read only a small portion of that record. Most of it is still there, still waiting, under the surface of the water or in the soil beside it. The mud flood researchers look at the Ob and the other great Siberian rivers, the Yenisei, the Lena, the Ama, and they say, here is where the evidence is. Here, in this enormous, largely unexplored territory, are the ruins of the Tartarian civilization, under the permafrost, under the taiga, under the tundra. And conventional archaeologists, though they do not frame it in the language of Tartaria, would agree with the basic premise. Siberia is archaeologically underexplored. The conditions that make it difficult to live there also make it difficult to excavate. The permafrost preserves things extraordinarily well, but is also difficult to dig through. There are discoveries being made in Siberia as the permafrost thaws due to climate change. Ancient viruses, ancient animals, ancient plant life, and occasionally ancient human artifacts. What else is there, waiting under the ice? We do not know, and that not knowing is one of the most honest and humbling things about the present moment. The world is full of things we have not yet found. Chapter 28. The Global Village. Before the Global Village, here is a thought that sounds strange but is actually well supported by evidence. The ancient world was more connected than we often think. We tend to imagine ancient peoples as isolated, each civilization developing in a bubble, unaware of what was happening on the other side of the world. Greeks not knowing about China, Egyptians not knowing about the Americas. But the evidence increasingly suggests that ancient peoples were more mobile, more connected, and more globally aware than the standard story admits. There is genetic evidence of ancient contact between populations we thought were isolated. There is archaeological evidence of goods travelling extraordinary distances. Obsidian from volcanic islands appearing in mainland archaeological sites hundreds of miles away. Amber from the Baltic Sea appearing in Bronze Age Mediterranean graves. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan appearing in ancient Egyptian jewellery. There are controversial claims of contact between the Old World and the Americas long before Columbus. Most of these claims are debated and many are rejected by mainstream scholarship, but some, like the presence of certain crop plants and genetic markers that suggest pre-Columbian contact, are taken seriously by researchers. The ancient world was a network, a global network, slower than ours, more difficult, more dangerous, but real. The Silk Road was its most famous expression, but there were other roads, sea routes, river routes, mountain passes, desert crossings, and along these routes not just goods moved, ideas moved, people moved, knowledge moved. The same architectural principles appearing in different parts of the world might not indicate a single lost civilization. It might indicate a world that was more connected, more in conversation, than the fragmented history we have inherited suggests. This is perhaps the most realistic version of what the Tartaria theory is pointing toward. Not a single global empire, not a single civilization with one language and one government and one set of buildings, but a world that was more unified than we remember. More in contact, more mutually aware, a global village before the global village, with all the complexity that implies, with all the trade and exchange and conflict and cooperation and loss and survival that human connection always involves. And then something happened. Climate change, the disruption of trade routes, the rise of isolationist empires, the plagues, the wars, and the connections broke, and the world fragmented into the separated, mutually unaware civilizations that standard history describes. Not because the connections were never real, but because connections are fragile, and the world is very large, and time is long, and what connects can also break. Chapter 29. What we build. When we are afraid. There is a reason that human beings across all cultures and all eras build. We build to survive, to shelter ourselves from cold and heat and rain. That is the most basic reason. But we also build for reasons that go beyond survival. We build to leave something behind, to say, I was here, we were here, this existed. The pyramids were not built for survival, they were built to outlast time, to carry the name and the power and the soul of the pharaoh forward, beyond death, beyond the reach of forgetting. The cathedrals were not built for warmth, they were built to touch the sky, to make the human being standing inside feel the presence of something vast and sacred, to say, this is what we believe, this is what we value, this is what we are willing to sacrifice generations to create. The great bridges, the long walls, the towering libraries, the ornate city halls, all of these were built with an awareness of time. An awareness that the builders would die and their children would die and their children's children would die, and still the building would stand. There is something in human beings that reaches toward permanence, that wants to build something that will outlast the flesh. And in that reaching, there is something almost like defiance. Defiance of time, of entropy, of the fact that everything ends. The mud flood theory, at its emotional core, is a story about that defiance, about a civilization that built something extraordinary, something that was meant to last, and about the strange, sad irony that their most lasting achievement was not their knowledge or their culture or their people, it was their stones, the buildings that survived when everything else was lost, standing there, half buried, their ground floors filled with mud, their decorations worn but intact, their proportions still speaking of a time when someone understood something about beauty and proportion that we have only partially recovered. If Tartaria existed, its greatest monument is not in any archive or any book. It is in the buildings, the ones that are still there, that you can touch, that you can walk through, that you can stand in front of in the early morning light and feel, without being able to say why, that something here is older than the sign on the door says. That something here was made by hands that knew what they were doing, deeply and completely and without the aid of anything we would recognize as modern technology. And that this knowledge, whatever it was, wherever it came from, deserves to be remembered, not just catalogued, not just studied, felt, the way you feel the cold air in an old stone building, the way you feel the weight of centuries in the silence of a cathedral, the way you feel standing at the bottom of an enormous old tower that something here is speaking to you across time, saying, we were here, saying, we built this so that you would know, saying, do not forget us. And perhaps on quiet nights like this one, when the city is still and the mind is open and the world feels larger and stranger than usual, we do not forget, even when we do not know exactly who we are remembering. The feeling of remembrance is enough, the stone is enough, the silence is enough. And the story goes on, deeper and deeper into the long layered night of history. Let us follow it a little further. The story has been moving through you for a while now. Maybe you have shifted position. Maybe the pillow feels different than it did at the beginning. Maybe the room has grown a little quieter, or the sounds outside have changed, the way night sounds do as the hours move deeper toward morning. We have covered a great distance together, through the buried buildings and the old maps, through the frozen mammoths and the Silk Road cities, through the orphaned trains and the White City and the towers with their strange, beautiful caps. And now we are entering a different kind of territory. The outer chapters of a mystery are always full of evidence and argument, loud with questions, bright with the excitement of discovery. But the inner chapters are quieter. The inner chapters are where the wondering settles into something softer, where the facts give way gently to feeling, where the question stops demanding an answer and begins simply to exist, as questions sometimes do when we finally allow them to. Let us move inward now. Chapter 30. The Philosophers and the Lost World. Every culture in human history has a story about a lost world, not just Tartaria, not just Atlantis, every culture. The ancient Greeks told the story of Atlantis, a great island civilization that sank beneath the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophe. Plato wrote about it in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, describing it as a real place, a real history, told to the Greeks by Egyptian priests who had kept the memory alive. Most scholars believe Atlantis was a philosophical device, a thought experiment, a story Plato invented or adapted to illustrate ideas about hubris and the fall of civilizations, not a historical record. But the image has persisted for 2,500 years, has been searched for, theorized about, mapped and remapped onto dozens of different locations, has never been found and yet has never been fully abandoned. The Hindus tell of the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, the first and most perfect of the 4 great cycles of time. A period when human beings lived in harmony with the universe, when knowledge was complete, when the world was as it was meant to be, and from that perfection, through the slow turning of the cosmic cycles, we have descended to the Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and forgetting. The Norse spoke of a world before this world, a time before the current order, before Odin and the other gods established the cosmos we know. Ancient, primordial, lost. Indigenous peoples across the Americas speak of previous worlds, previous creations, worlds that were destroyed and from which the survivors emerged into this one. This is everywhere, in every culture, in every era, in every part of the world. The memory of a better, older, more complete world, lost, destroyed, buried, waiting somehow to be recovered. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, would have called this an archetype, a fundamental pattern of human thought, woven into the structure of our psychological inheritance, the lost paradise, the fall from grace, the golden age now past. It is not evidence of Tartaria. It is evidence of something deeper. It is evidence that human beings, across all their diversity, share a particular kind of grief, a grief for what is lost, for what was and is no more, for the possibility of wholeness that seems always to exist in the past or in the future, but never quite in the present. This grief is real, it is profound, and it is one of the most distinctively human things there is. The Tartaria theory, whatever its historical accuracy, is an expression of this grief, a modern myth, built from real photographs and real maps and real anomalies, but shaped by this ancient universal longing, the longing to recover something that was whole. And perhaps, in following the story tonight, we are doing what human beings have always done when they tell stories around a fire, or inscribe myths on clay tablets, or whisper narratives in the dark. We are honouring that grief. We are saying, something was lost. We do not know exactly what, but we feel its absence, and we are not willing to pretend that we do not. Chapter 31. The Architecture of Healing. Let us think about why old buildings feel the way they do. You have probably experienced this. Walking into an old building and feeling something shift inside you, something slow down, something settle. It happens in cathedrals and mosques and temples, yes, but also in old libraries, old train stations, old courthouses, old universities, even old farmhouses. There's a quality in those spaces that is hard to name, a solidity, a sense that the walls have witnessed things, that the space has absorbed time, the way old wood absorbs the smell of everything that has happened near it. Scientists and architects call some of this biophilic design, the idea that human beings respond positively to certain proportions, certain materials, certain relationships between light and shadow and space, that we are, in some deep evolutionary way, wired to feel safe and calm in spaces that meet certain criteria. High ceilings, natural materials, the presence of curves rather than only hard angles, the interaction of light with textured surfaces, spaces that are large enough to feel expansive but not so large that they feel threatening. Many of the buildings attributed to the Tartarian style, the grand classical buildings of the 19th century, the domed civic structures, the arched train stations, the ornate libraries, happen to embody many of these principles. They feel good to be in, not just aesthetically, physiologically. Your body relaxes in them, your breathing slows, your attention, instead of snagging on discomfort and urgency, opens into a wider, quieter mode. This might be the most persuasive and the most gentle argument for paying attention to these buildings. Not because of what they prove about history, but because of what they do to human beings who stand inside them. They make us feel held. They make us feel that the world has a kind of order and beauty that exceeds the demands of the moment. They make us feel, for a little while, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, something that has been here longer than we have, and will be here long after we're gone. And in that feeling, there is rest, real rest. Not just the absence of activity, but the presence of peace. Whatever civilization built these structures, whoever designed these proportions and carved these stones and raised these domes, they understood something about the human need for beauty, for scale, for the feeling of being sheltered within something that knows more than you do. And that understanding, wherever it came from, is a gift, one that is still being given every time someone walks into one of these spaces and feels the noise of the world grow quiet. Chapter 32. The Hidden Rooms. There is a persistent claim within the mud flood theory that many old buildings contain hidden rooms below the current ground floor, rooms that were sealed up when the buildings were repurposed or when the ground level rose, rooms that, in some cases, were left exactly as they were, furnished, equipped, as if the people who used them simply left one day and the door was closed behind them. Some researchers claim to have found such rooms in various buildings, basements that extend far below the current basement level, corridors that lead to sealed doorways, spaces beneath city streets that correspond to the ground floors of buildings now buried to their second story. Now, hidden rooms in old buildings are real. They are documented. Old buildings frequently have sealed-off spaces, rooms that were blocked up during renovations, passages that were filled in, cellars that were forgotten. Sometimes these spaces contain interesting things, old furniture, old documents, old artifacts that were simply left behind when the space was closed off. Archaeologists and urban historians document these findings regularly. They are fascinating. They provide genuine windows into the past. But the mudflood researchers go further. They claim that some of these hidden spaces contain evidence of the Tartarian civilization specifically. Technology that does not fit the official timeline, artifacts with no explanation in the standard historical record. These specific claims are harder to verify. The documented cases of hidden rooms in old buildings are real. The specific claims about Tartarian technology and artifacts in those rooms are largely unverified. But the image is evocative. The idea of a room beneath a room, a world beneath a world, a layer of time sealed behind a wall, preserved in the dark, waiting. There is something in that image that resonates far beyond any specific historical claim. Because all of us, in our own lives, have rooms like that, memories sealed off, parts of ourselves that were closed up during difficult times and never quite reopened, old versions of who we were, preserved somewhere beneath the surface, in the dark, in the silence. The mudflood theory talks about the hidden rooms of history, but the feeling it produces is about the hidden rooms in ourselves, the places we do not go to, the things we do not remember, the selves we were before something happened, before the mud covered the ground floor and we had to find a new entrance to our own house. And perhaps, on quiet nights like this, when we allow ourselves to slow down and listen to a long, gentle story about lost civilizations and buried buildings, we are not only exploring history, we are visiting our own sealed rooms, gently, carefully, without forcing any doors, just standing in the corridor, feeling the quality of the air, knowing that something is there behind the wall, and allowing that knowing to be enough. Chapter 33. The Bones of Giants. There is a subset of the mudflood theory that overlaps with another older set of alternative history claims. The claim that the pre-Tartarian or Tartarian world was inhabited by beings larger than modern humans, giants. This is an ancient claim. It is found in almost every world mythology. The Bible describes the Nephilim, beings of enormous stature. Greek mythology is full of giants. Norse mythology has the Jotnad, the giant beings who predated the gods. Hindu texts describe immense beings from earlier ages. Indigenous traditions across the Americas describe giant ancestors. And the alternative history community, including the mudflood researchers, frequently claims that evidence of these giants has been suppressed. That enormous human skeletons have been found and hidden by institutions like the Smithsonian. That giant-sized doors and furniture in old buildings prove their inhabitants were much taller than modern humans. I want to address this gently and honestly. The claims of suppressed giant skeletons are not supported by credible evidence. The stories of the Smithsonian hiding giant bones have been investigated by journalists and researchers and have not been substantiated. Many of the photographs circulating online showing giant skeletons are digitally altered. The giant-sized doors in old buildings have a simpler explanation. Grand public buildings were designed to appear imposing and impressive. Oversized doors were an architectural statement about power and grandeur, not an accommodation for physically larger inhabitants. So the giant hypothesis, as a literal claim about the physical size of past human populations, does not hold up to scrutiny. But the mythological resonance of giants is worth pausing on. Why do giants appear in the stories of almost every culture? One possibility is that these stories are memories of actual large animals. Fossil bones of mammoths, dinosaurs, and other large extinct creatures were found by ancient peoples who did not have paleontology to explain them. They interpreted these bones through their existing frameworks. Enormous bones meant enormous beings, giants. This is a real documented phenomenon. Ancient Greek giant myths correspond geographically to regions where large fossil beds exist. The ancient Greeks may have been interpreting dinosaur and mammoth fossils as the bones of their mythological giants. Another possibility is that giant myths are metaphorical, that giants represent earlier, more powerful civilizations, peoples who built things that later, less capable societies could not imagine constructing with ordinary human hands. If you are a medieval farmer looking at the ruins of a Roman aqueduct and you cannot imagine how such a thing was built, you might say, giants built this. Not because you believe in literal giants, but because the scale of what you are looking at exceeds your frame of reference. The word giant becomes a measure of incomprehension, a way of saying, whoever built this was greater than us, more powerful, more capable, beyond our understanding, and in that sense the giants are real. Not as physical beings, but as a feeling. The feeling of standing in front of something enormous and knowing that something greater than yourself made it. That feeling is as old as human beings, and it lives on in every person who looks up at an old dome or an ancient stone wall or a towering arch and feels small and humble and grateful. Chapter 34. The slow forgetting of names. Names disappear. This is one of the quietest forms of loss, and one of the most complete. When a language dies, it takes with it not just words but ways of seeing. Distinctions that existed in that language, between types of snow, or kinds of love, or qualities of light, distinctions that had no equivalent in other languages, they vanish. The concepts they describe become not just unnamed, but unthinkable. Not because the human mind cannot think them, but because without a word, a thought has no place to anchor. Languages have been dying for as long as languages have existed. Every time a conquest happened, every time a dominant culture absorbed a smaller one, every time children were taken from their communities and forced to speak a different tongue, a language was weakened. Sometimes it recovered, sometimes it did not. Today, linguists estimate that roughly half of the world's 7,000 or so remaining languages are endangered. Within a century, many of them may be gone. With them will go thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge, encoded in the specific structures and vocabularies of those languages. The names of plants and animals that have no equivalent in major languages, the navigational knowledge encoded in Pacific Islander languages, the ecological wisdom embedded in the vocabularies of peoples who have lived in specific environments for thousands of years. This is happening now, not in the past, not in some lost ancient era. Now. The mud flood theory talks about the erasure of a civilization, about the deliberate destruction of a historical record. And while the specific claims of the theory are debated, the general phenomenon it describes is happening in front of our eyes. Cultures are being lost, languages are disappearing. Ways of knowing and being and building and relating to the world are vanishing, not because of a single catastrophic mud flood, but because of the slow, grinding pressure of cultural dominance. The Tartaria theory's emotional core is a response to this real grief. The grief of a world that is losing its diversity, losing its depth, flattening into a single, homogeneous surface that covers over all the richness beneath. And that grief deserves acknowledgement, not in the form of elaborate alternative histories with insufficient evidence, but in the simpler, more honest form of noticing what is disappearing, of paying attention, of choosing deliberately to remember. The name Tartaria may or may not refer to a real lost civilization, but the feeling it evokes, the feeling that something vast and beautiful and varied has been covered over, that the world was richer than it now appears, that feeling is pointing at something true, something worth sitting with, something worth grieving quietly in the dark. Chapter 35. The photographs we cannot explain. Let us return one more time to the photographs, because the photographs are where the mud flood theory feels most tangible, most concrete, most difficult to dismiss with a wave of the hand. There is a series of photographs taken in various American cities in the mid to late 1800s. In these photographs, you can see streets where the ground level is clearly lower than it is today. You can see buildings with their lower floors at street level that, in photographs taken just decades later, have those same lower floors partially buried. You can see the city of San Francisco in early photographs, taken just years after the gold rush, showing buildings that look decades older than they should. Grand, classical structures with worn facades and aged stonework, in a city that was supposedly brand new. You can see photographs of Chicago, of St. Louis, of Cincinnati, showing similar anomalies. Buildings that appear too old for their documented founding dates. Streets that appear to have been cut down through existing layers of earth rather than built up. You can see photographs from Russia, from Central Asia, from the Middle East, showing grand structures in states of apparent abandonment, empty plazas, unpopulated streets. The grandeur of old civilization without the noise of the people who built it. Now, each of these photographs has an explanation. Long exposure times required stillness. People were present but blurred into invisibility by the camera's long shutter speed, leaving streets appearing empty. Buildings in new cities looked aged because Victorian architecture deliberately evoked classical antiquity. Street levels changed as cities paved and repaved and raised their grades to improve drainage. These are real explanations. Most of them are convincing. But the mud flood researchers look at all of these photographs together and they say, the weight of anomaly is too great. Too many photographs from too many places showing too many of the same unusual features. Coincidence cannot explain all of it. And then they say something that is, in its way, quite beautiful. They say, look at these photographs as if you did not already know the story. Set aside what you were told about when these cities were built and by whom. Look at the buildings, the streets, the scale, the age in the stone. Look with fresh eyes. And when you do, they say, what you see is not a young civilization building itself from scratch. What you see is a young civilization moving into an older one, cleaning it up, repainting the facades, renaming the streets, writing new signs over old doorways, setting up house in a home they did not build, and whether or not that is literally true, the exercise itself is valuable. Looking at the world with fresh eyes, setting aside the story you were given and asking, what do I actually see? Not as a method for discovering Tartaria, but as a practice, the practice of seeing, of not taking the label for the thing, of not assuming the explanation is the full story, of remaining curious, gently, persistently, humbly curious. Chapter 36. The world is older than we remember. This phrase has been running through our story like a quiet current beneath still water. The world is older than we remember. Let us sit with it fully now, in this later part of the night. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. That number is so large it has no emotional meaning. It is just sounds. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Also incomprehensible. Life on Earth has existed for roughly 3.5 billion years. Still too large. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have existed for approximately 300,000 years. Getting closer. Complex human civilization, with cities and writing and organized religion and trade networks, has existed for roughly 10,000 years. Smaller, more imaginable. And the period that standard history focuses on, the last 3,000 or 4,000 years of documented civilization, is a thin layer on top of all of that. A very thin layer. And within that layer, the last 500 years that the mud flood theory is concerned with are thinner still. And yet, the depth of what even these 500 years contain, the number of lives lived, the number of buildings built and torn down, the number of languages spoken, the number of children born, the number of fires lit against the cold, it is staggering. And most of it is gone. Not because of conspiracy, not because of a mud flood, but because that is what time does. Time erases, not maliciously, not deliberately, but completely. The overwhelming majority of everything that has ever happened is gone. Not recorded, not remembered, not preserved, just gone. Into the air, into the ground, into the quiet, total darkness of the unremembered past. And we are here now, in this thin, bright slice of the present, surrounded by the faint traces of everything that came before. The buildings that are still standing, the stories that survived the fires, the photographs on silver plates, the the names on the old maps, these are the fragments that made it through, and we hold them carefully, gratefully, knowing how much was lost for each fragment that survived, knowing that we are walking on top of an unfathomable depth of lost history, and that the correct response to that knowing is not anxiety, it is wonder and gratitude. Gratitude for the fragments that remain, for the buildings still standing in the morning light, for the maps in the archives, for the stories that somehow, against all probability, made it through, including this one. Chapter 37. The quiet ones who remembered history is mostly written about large events, about wars and conquests and the rise and fall of empires, but history also lives in quieter places, in grandmothers who remembered the names of rivers that no longer appear on any map, in craftsmen who passed down techniques through their hands rather than through books, in communities that kept old calendars and old holidays long after the official calendar had moved on. The mud flood theory often talks about deliberate suppression of Tartarian history, about institutions that hid the evidence, about powerful forces that rewrote the record. But there is another kind of preservation that the theory does not always focus on, the quiet kind. The kind that happens in family stories passed down at kitchen tables, in the carved details of folk art that echo, without explanation, the decorative language of grand old buildings, in the songs of peoples who are conquered but not entirely silenced, in the names of places that survived the conquest of the places themselves. History hides in these places, real history, the history that was not written down, or was written down and burned, but survived anyway because human memory is stubborn and tenacious and finds ways to carry what it needs to carry. The people of the Volga region of Russia still tell stories about a golden time before the Russian conquest. The indigenous peoples of Central Asia still have oral traditions that describe a more abundant, more organized world before the great disruptions of the last few centuries. The craftsmen who build in the old styles without entirely knowing why they build that way are carrying something, some memory, some knowledge, some aesthetic truth that was passed down through their hands, from hands before them, in an unbroken chain of making that stretches back further than anyone now alive can trace. This is not the dramatic global civilizational preservation that the mud flood theory sometimes describes. It is smaller, quieter, more human, but it is real, and it is extraordinary. The fact that something of the old world survives, not in grand claims and alternative history documentaries, but in the hands of a craftsman, in the melody of a song, in the way a grandmother describes the shape of the hill that her grandmother described, in the same words to her, that is survival, that is memory. That is the quiet, persistent refusal of the human story to be entirely erased. And it is perhaps the most beautiful thing about us, that we remember, even when we do not know exactly what we are remembering, even when the words no longer fit the thing they are trying to describe, even when all we have left is the shape of a longing, we remember. Chapter 38. The energy of the old places. There is something that travellers often report about very old places, sacred sites, ancient ruins, places where human beings have gathered for centuries or millennia, a quality of the air, a feeling of density, of presence, of something accumulated in the space over long years of human attention and intention. Scientists would likely explain this in terms of psychology. We bring our expectations with us. When we visit a place we have been told is sacred, we experience it as sacred. Our brains, primed by expectation and story, produce the experience the story has prepared us for. This is probably a significant part of the explanation. But there are researchers who take a different view, who study what they call the energetics of place, the way that certain geographic features, underground water, specific rock formations, particular electromagnetic conditions may produce measurable effects on human physiology. Some sacred sites, like Stonehenge in England, like the great temple complexes of ancient Mexico, like the standing stone circles of Scotland, are built at locations that have specific geological features, specific acoustic properties, specific relationships to solar and lunar cycles. Whether these features were deliberately chosen by the builders, and if so, what knowledge they used to identify them, is a genuine research question. The mud flood theory takes this question and frames it within the Tartarian context. It says the old civilization understood the energetics of place in a way we do not, that they built their structures at specific locations because they knew how those locations interacted with the energies of the earth and the sky. That their buildings were not just beautiful, they were functional in ways we no longer understand. Interacting with forces we have forgotten how to perceive, this is speculative. The scientific evidence for it is thin. But the underlying intuition, that place matters, that certain locations have qualities that affect human beings in real ways, that our ancestors may have understood something about their environment that we have traded away in the rush toward abstraction and measurement. That intuition is worth taking seriously, because the experience of place is real. The feeling of being in certain old spaces, certain ancient landscapes, certain quiet valleys where generations of human beings have lived and died and gathered, that feeling is real, whatever is causing it. And the world is full of such places, waiting, holding their long accumulated silence, ready for anyone who arrives slowly enough and quietly enough to feel it. Chapter 39. The Dream of the Whole World. There is something that the Tartaria theory dreams of. Beneath all the photographs and the old maps and the buried buildings and the orphan trains and the free energy towers, there is a dream of a world that was whole, not perfect. Not utopian in the sense of having no conflict or struggle or loss, but whole in the sense of being connected, unified, sharing a common understanding of what it meant to build something beautiful and what it meant to live in it. A world where the person in what is now Russia and the person in what is now Chicago and the person in what is now Istanbul all recognized the same aesthetic, moved through the same kinds of spaces, looked up at the same proportions and felt the same kind of peace. A world with a shared language of form and beauty, even if they spoke different words. And then, the dream says, something happened, and the world broke apart and the shared language was lost. And each fragment of the old civilization went its own way, carrying pieces of the old knowledge but no longer knowing the whole. Like children after a shipwreck, each swimming toward a different shore, carrying whatever they managed to grab before the ship went under. This dream is the emotional center of the Tartaria theory. And it resonates because it describes something that human beings feel very deeply. The sense that we are fragments, that we carry pieces of something larger, that the world we live in is a partial thing, a recovered thing, built on foundations we do not fully understand by hands that remembered something we have forgotten, and the longing to recover the whole, not by going backward, not by undoing history, but by finding the thread that runs through all the fragments, by recognizing in the arch of a doorway or the proportions of a dome, or the way a particular building makes you feel on a quiet morning, the signature of something that was once whole and is perhaps slowly becoming whole again, one building at a time, one story at a time, one quiet night of wondering at a time. The world is older than we remember, and the dream of wholeness is older still. It has been dreamed in every language, in every era, on every continent, and it is being dreamed right now, in this room, in this darkness, in the quiet breathing of someone who is listening and wondering and allowing themselves to feel the weight of everything that has been lost, and the strange, patient hope that something of it remains. We have come a long way together tonight, through the buried cities and the old maps, through the frozen ground of Siberia and the grand white buildings of the World's Fair, through the orphan trains and the cathedral stones and the towers pointing quietly at the sky, through the grief of lost languages and the dream of a world that was once whole. And now we are here, in the last and softest part of the story, the part where the facts grow quieter, where the questions stop pressing so hard, where the mystery stops demanding resolution and simply breathes. You have been listening for a long time now, and I am grateful for that. For your patience with this long, slow story, for your willingness to follow it into the dark, not knowing exactly where it was going, trusting that somewhere in the telling there was something worth hearing. There is. Let us find it together in these final, gentle pages. Chapter 40. The morning after a long dream. There is a particular quality to the world in the hours just before dawn. Everything is still. The darkness is at its deepest. But somewhere, very far away, something is beginning to change. The sky at the horizon holds the faintest memory of blue. Not light exactly, just the suggestion that light is possible. The world in those hours feels ancient. It feels the way it must have felt before cities, before electricity, before the noise we have come to think of as ordinary. In those hours, if you are awake, if you are quiet, the world reveals something about itself, that it is very old, that it was here long before you arrived, that it will be here long after you're gone, and that this is not a sad fact, not a frightening one. It is simply the truth, and the truth held gently is one of the most comforting things there is. The Tartaria theory, in all its sprawling, passionate, imperfect searching, is really searching for this feeling, the feeling of the world's depth, of its age, of the layers upon layers of human life and human dreaming and human building that lie beneath the surface of the present moment. It is searching for the pre-dawn world, the one that existed before the noise, before the official record, before the version of history that was written by the victors and the powerful and the institutions that had reasons to shape what was remembered. It is searching for the raw, unmediated reality of the past, and that search, however imperfect its methods, however shaky its specific claims, is a fundamentally human one. We all search for that, in our own ways, in old photographs, in antique shops, in the smell of old books, in the feeling of standing in a very old building and sensing the weight of all the lives that passed through it before yours. We are all, in our way, searching for the world beneath the world, for the ground beneath the mud. Chapter 41. What the stars say about memory. On a clear night, the stars are a kind of lesson in time. When you look at a star, you're not seeing the star as it is now. You're seeing it as it was when the light you're receiving left its surface. And depending on how far away the star is, that light might have been travelling for years, or centuries, or millions of years. The star you're looking at might not even exist anymore. It might have died while its light was still travelling toward your eyes. You're looking at the past. You're receiving a message from something that may no longer be there, and you cannot know, just by looking, which stars are still burning and which are already gone. The light looks the same either way. There is something in this that speaks directly to the Tartaria mystery. When we look at old buildings, old photographs, old maps, we're receiving light from the past, messages from something that existed before us. But we cannot always know, just by looking, what is still there and what is already gone. What is a true remnant and what is a reflection? What is real memory and what is the afterglow of something that ended long ago? The old buildings are real. The photographs are real. The maps are real, but what they mean, what they are evidence of, what civilization built them and why, and what happened to that civilization, that is the journey the light has been on. And by the time it reaches us, we cannot always know how long it travelled, or what it passed through on the way, or how much it changed. We receive it anyway. We look anyway. We wonder anyway, because that is what it means to be human, to stand in the dark and look up at lights that may already be gone, and to find in them something beautiful, something worth attending to, something that says, here, once, there was fire, there was heat, there was a burning, and even the memory of that burning is a kind of light. Even the echo of a lost civilization is a kind of presence. Even the question, asked sincerely in the dark, is a kind of answer. Chapter 42. The mud and the seed. Let us think about what mud actually does, not in the theory, in nature. Mud, river sediment, the fine particulate material that floods carry and deposit, it is one of the most fertile substances on Earth. The ancient Egyptians knew this. The Nile flooded every year, depositing rich black silt across the farmland of the delta. This silt was extraordinarily fertile. It made the land bloom. Without it, there would have been no Egypt, no pyramids, no pharaohs, no civilization along that river. The flood brought destruction. It covered everything. It disrupted the ordinary life of the people living in its path, and then it receded, and it left behind the richest soil on earth. The mud was not only destruction, it was also gift, and the seeds that were buried by the flood, the ones that were covered over and hidden in the darkness of the silt, were not destroyed. They were incubating, waiting for the right conditions, for water and warmth and time, and then, when the conditions were right, they pushed upward through the mud, slowly, persistently, into the light. This is perhaps the most beautiful way to hold the Tartaria story, not as a conspiracy, not as a proven history, but as a metaphor. The old world was covered, maybe by mud, maybe by time, maybe by the deliberate choices of the powerful, maybe by the simple, unplanned erosion of centuries, It was covered, but not destroyed, because something of it survived, in the buildings, in the stories, in the persistent human sense that the world is older and richer than the version we were given, in the questions that keep being asked, in the researchers who keep looking at old photographs and old maps and old buildings and refusing to accept that there is nothing interesting there, in the dreamers and the wanderers and the people who lie in the dark at night and think, there must have been more, there must have been something deeper, something we have not yet found. These people are the seeds, buried in the mud, but still alive, still waiting for the light. Chapter 43. The Builders. We never knew somewhere. In whatever version of history is closest to the truth, there were builders, real people, with hands and shoulders and the ache that comes from lifting heavy things all day, with children who waited for them at home, with preferences and disagreements and songs they sang to get through the long afternoon. Real people who looked at a blank space in a city and imagined something rising from it, who drew plans or held them in their heads or described them in words to other people who then translated the words into stone. Real people who cut the stone, who mixed the mortar, who climbed the scaffolding with their hearts in their throats, who placed one stone on top of another and another on top of that and watched the arch begin to take shape, and felt the particular human joy of a form becoming real. These people existed. Whether they were Romans or medieval Christians or Tartarians or Victorian construction workers or some civilization we have not yet named, real people built the buildings that are still standing, and almost none of them are remembered. The architects sometimes, the patrons who paid for the work usually, the rulers who claim the glory of what was built in their names always, but the cutters of stone, the layers of brick, the carriers of material, the mixers of mortar, the people who got up before dawn and came home after dark and went to sleep with sore hands and got up and did it again. They are gone, completely gone. No record, no name, no face, and yet their work is still here. Every old building that is still standing is a monument to unknown people, to hands that are gone and names that were never written down. And when we walk into one of these buildings and feel that quality of presence, that weight of accumulated time, that sense of something held and preserved, part of what we are feeling is them, not their ghosts, not in any mystical sense, but the physical evidence of their existence, the proof that they were here, that they worked, that they cared enough about what they were building to do it well. The mortar they mixed is still holding the stones together, their work is still standing, and that is a form of immortality that no name in any history book can quite match. The anonymous immortality of the well-made thing. Chapter 44. The River of Forgetting. There is a concept in ancient Greek mythology called the river Lethe. In the Greek understanding of the afterlife, the dead would eventually drink from this river, and the water of the Lethe caused complete forgetfulness. Every memory of the life just lived, every face, every feeling, every moment of joy or sorrow wiped away. Blank. Clean. Ready for a new life. The Greeks did not describe this as punishment. It was simply the nature of things. The soul needed to forget in order to begin again. But there was another river, the Mnemosyne, the river of memory. Some souls, the initiates of certain mystery cults, were taught to drink from Mnemosyne instead of Lethe, to remember, to carry their memories into whatever came next. This choice between forgetting and remembering is one of the oldest human questions. Is forgetting a mercy? Does the weight of everything that has been lost become eventually too heavy to carry? Is there wisdom in the clean slate? In the new beginning that requires the old ending to be released? Or is memory the thing that makes us who we are? Is the loss of memory, even painful memory, a kind of death? Is remembering, however painful, the only way to honour what was real? The Tartaria theory is firmly on the side of memory. It says, we should not forget. We should not accept the clean slate that history hands us. We should dig through the mud and recover what was buried and refuse to let the erasure stand. And there is courage in that position, and love. The love of what was, the refusal to accept loss as final. But there is also wisdom in the river of forgetting. Not the forgetting that is imposed by power, not the deliberate erasure of someone else's history, but the personal quiet forgetting that allows us to live in the present. To be here, now, in this room, in this darkness, without being crushed by the full weight of everything that is gone. Both rivers flow, and perhaps the wisest thing is not to choose between them, but to know when to drink from each, to remember enough to honour what was, to let go enough to be here, now, to hold the question of Tartaria and the mud flood and the buried buildings and the old maps with genuine curiosity, genuine respect for the mystery, and also with open hands, not grasping, not demanding certainty, not needing the story to resolve, just holding it, lightly, gently, in the dark. Chapter 45, The Long Slow Return. If there was a civilization before our own, and if something of it survived, where is it returning? Not in the way conspiracy theories describe, not in hidden bunkers or secret archives or the basements of powerful institutions, but in the slow, organic way that things return when they are not forced. In the revival of traditional craftsmanship, the people who are learning again to cut stone by hand, to carve wood, to lay tile in the old patterns, to build with natural materials that breathe and age gracefully, in the growing attention to biophilic design. The architects and urban planners who are realizing that human beings need greenery and natural light, and spaces that are proportioned for human comfort, not for efficiency alone. In the researchers, mainstream and alternative alike, who are looking at old buildings and old maps with fresh eyes, who are asking questions that were not asked before. In the archaeologists who are finding things in the permafrost in the jungle under the ocean that require the story of human civilization to be written a little longer, a little more complex, a little more surprising than it was before. In the people who travel to old places and stand in front of old buildings and feel something they cannot name, and who do not dismiss that feeling. Who say, something is here. I do not know what it is, but it is real. The return is slow, it is quiet, it does not announce itself, but it is happening. In the same way that seeds buried in mud push upward when the conditions are right, in the same way that light from a distant star finally reaches the eyes of someone who is looking, in the same way that a story, told in the dark at the end of a long night, finds its way into a listening mind and settles there, quietly, without force, without urgency, just arriving. Chapter 46. The room you are in. Maybe you are in your bedroom right now. Maybe there is a blanket over you. Maybe the pillow under your head is soft and familiar. Maybe the room is very dark, or there is a little light coming from somewhere, from a screen, from a streetlight, through a curtain. Maybe you have been listening for a long time, and maybe the story is blurred a little at the edges, the way things do when the mind begins to soften. That is good. That is exactly right. Because the room you're in right now is also, in its small way, part of the story we have been telling. You're in a room built by people whose names you do not know, in a city built on layers of history you have not fully explored, on land that was something else before it was what it is now, under a sky that has looked down on every civilization that has ever existed, and will look down on everything that comes after you. You are, right now, a living layer in the great sediment of human time. One day you too will be part of the past. Your present moment, this one, this exact breath you're taking right now, will become history. Will join the vast accumulating record of moments that have been lived and passed and gone. And that is not sad. It is not frightening. It is the nature of things. The gentle, inexorable nature of time. You're here now, breathing now, listening now, and the world, old and layered and strange and full of buried mysteries, is holding you. The same way it has held everyone who has ever been in a room at the end of a long day, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of their own existence, wondering what came before them and what will come after. You are not alone in this. You never were. Chapter 47. What the buildings want you to know, if the old buildings could speak. If the stones could transmit directly whatever they have absorbed over the centuries, what would they say? Not conspiracy, not secret history, not urgent warnings. I think they would say something much simpler. They would say, slow down. They would say, look up. They would say, notice the curve of this arch. Feel the way the light falls through this window at this time of day. Stand here, just for a moment, and let yourself be small. Let yourself be contained within something larger than yourself. This is what we were built for. Not to impress, not to intimidate, but to remind you that beauty is possible, that the human hand, given time and skill and the right materials, can make something that outlasts every argument, every war, every empire, every erasure. Something that just is, quietly and enduringly and beautifully. And when you stand in it, or think about it, or hear a story about it in the dark at the end of a long night, you become part of it, part of the long chain of human beings who have stood in similar spaces and felt similar things, connected across time by nothing more than the experience of beauty, and the feeling that the world is larger and stranger and more layered than it appears, and that this is wonderful, not frightening, wonderful. Chapter 48. The last layer. Every archaeological site has a last layer, the deepest one, the one at the very bottom of the dig. Below this layer there is nothing human, no artifacts, no pottery, no charred wood, no animal bones that bear the marks of human tools, just the natural sediment of the earth going down and down into geological time. The last layer is where human history begins, at that site, in that place, and beneath it, silence. The long pre-human silence of a world that did not know us yet. The mud flood theory is, in a sense, a search for a deeper last layer, a search for a stratum of human civilization that lies beneath the one we have already found, one more layer down, one more chapter back. Maybe it is there, maybe somewhere, under the mud of a Siberian riverbank, or beneath the foundations of a grand old building in a city that has been continuously inhabited for centuries, or in the permafrost of a high Arctic valley. There is evidence of something we have not yet found, a last layer we have not yet reached, and maybe the people who will find it are not born yet. Maybe the technology to read it does not exist yet. Maybe the questions that will lead to it have not yet been formulated. Or maybe the search will go on for centuries more, and the layer will never be found because it was never there. And the mystery will remain a mystery, unresolved, open, breathing, and that will be all right. Because not every mystery needs to be solved to be meaningful. Some mysteries do their best work just by existing, by keeping the question alive, by preventing us from becoming too certain, too closed, too comfortable with the version of the world we were handed. The mystery of Tartaria, whatever its ultimate truth, has done that. It has made people look more carefully at old buildings, has made them ask questions about old maps, has made them think about what the ground beneath their feet might contain, has made them feel, in the dark at the end of a long day, that the world is vast and old and full of things not yet known. And that feeling is a gift. Chapter 49. The quietest truth. Here is the quietest truth of this whole long story. We do not know everything. That is it. That is the quietest truth. We do not know everything that happened in the past. We do not know all the civilizations that rose and fell before the ones we have documented. We do not know the full extent of ancient human knowledge. We do not know what lies beneath the undug layers of the earth. We do not know, and that is not a failure. It is not a conspiracy. It is not evidence of anything sinister. It is simply the condition of being human, of being finite, of living in a world that is so much older and larger and more complex than any individual mind or any collective record can contain. We do not know, and in that not knowing, there is space. Space for wonder, for curiosity, for the patient, open-hearted searching that produces both good science and good stories. Space for questions that do not yet have answers. Space for the mystery to breathe. You are lying in that space right now, in the not knowing, in the quiet, in the dark that is just slightly softer than it was a few hours ago. And the world around you, old and layered and strange and beautiful, is breathing with you. Chapter 50. The slow fade. It is late or early. In the hours before dawn, it is hard to tell the difference. The story has been long. The journey has covered a great distance, from the buried buildings to the frozen mammoths, from the old maps to the orphaned trains, from the white cities of the world's fairs to the Silk Road cities of Central Asia, from the question of what was lost to the quieter question of how to carry the not knowing. And now the story is finding its natural end, not because it has resolved, not because the mystery has been solved, but because some stories end not with an answer but with a feeling, and the feeling has arrived. It is the feeling of having travelled a long way in the dark and finding yourself, at the end of it, not in a different place but somehow more at home in the place you already were, more aware of the depth beneath you, more grateful for the building you are in, more patient with the questions that have no answers, more willing to let the world be old and strange and full of things you will never know. If the Tartarians existed, they are at rest now. Their civilization, whatever form it took, has completed its long arc through time. The mud has settled over what they built. And some of what they built is still there, still standing, still holding its proportions against the sky. That is enough. It is more than most things get. And if Tartaria was never quite what the theory claims, if it was a regional label and a collection of real but ordinary historical civilizations, not a single global empire of extraordinary beauty, then the beauty still exists. In the buildings that are attributed to it, in the questions it has inspired, in the searching it has motivated, in the photographs looked at more carefully, the maps read more slowly, the stones touched with more attention. The beauty is real, whatever its source. The wonder is real, whatever its object. The longing for a world that was whole is real, however it is expressed. And you, here, now in the quiet, you are real. Maybe your eyes are growing a little heavy. Maybe the room around you has taken on that particular quality of late-night softness, where the edges of things are less sharp, where the boundary between waking and sleeping is a gentle gradient rather than a hard line. That is all right. You have been on a long journey tonight. You have earned the rest. The questions will still be here in the morning. The mystery will still be breathing. The buildings will still be standing, their stones holding whatever they hold, their proportions still speaking quietly to anyone who takes the time to look. Nothing will be lost while you sleep. You can let it all go now. The mud and the maps, the towers and the trains, the frozen mammoths and the hidden rooms, the dream of a world that was whole. Let it all drift slowly like sediment settling in still water, slowly, quietly, down to the bottom, where it will wait for you, patient and undisturbed, until morning. The world is older than we remember, and it is here, and so are you, and that tonight is everything. Rest now. The story is not over. Stories like this one never end. They just grow quiet, like the river at night, like the old buildings in the dark, like the stars still burning, still sending their ancient light across the impossible distances, toward you, toward exactly here, toward exactly now. Sleep well.